Welcome back. I'm Joshua, and this is The Last Hike. In this video, we'll follow the stories behind some of the most insane hiking deaths ever recorded. From an arrogant TikTok influencer who flew to a sacred mountain in China and desecrated one of its most ancient trails, to a cocky linebacker whose confidence carried him miles into a desert furnace before his body quietly began to shut down. It was the 16th of October 2024, and the first cable cars of the morning were climbing out of the valley at Huashan, a granite mountain in north-central China whose ridgelines are so steep they look drawn rather than real. In one of those swaying cabins sat a 25-year-old American with a chest harness of camera gear, 2 phones, and a plan he'd been teasing his followers about for weeks. Below him, the cliffs of one of the most sacred mountains in the country dropped away in sheets of pale rock. He was not there for the temples, and he was not really there for the hike. He was there for roughly 15 seconds of video. His name was Dutton Stuckey. He was from Tempe, Arizona, and on TikTok he was a stunt and travel creator with a following in the thousands and ambitions far past it. His feed was a highlight reel of places most people would never stand. Rooftop edges, cliff jumps into green water, narrow ridgelines in Utah and Norway, always shot close, always with his easy grin in the corner of the frame. He was not reckless in the way people assume. He planned obsessively, scouted everything, and had never once been seriously hurt. That record was the most dangerous thing he owned. Here is the part of this story you have to sit with first. Dutton did not wake up that morning planning to gamble his life for strangers. He woke up planning content, the same as every other morning. Because when your identity, your sense of worth, and the career you are chasing all come from one app, the question is never whether a video is safe. The question is whether it will perform. Thousands of followers sounds like success to most people, but I see them as a number that'll only end up ruining you the more you obsess over it. Huashan is one of the 5 great mountains of China, a place Taoist hermits have climbed for more than 2,000 years, rising out of Shanxi province about 80 miles east of the old capital of Xi'an. It has 5 peaks, and the south peak is the highest of them, at just over 7,000 feet, a dome of bare granite with temples and stone stairways carved into it. It is a national 5A rated scenic area, the highest designation China gives, and on holiday weeks, tens of thousands of visitors a day move through its gondolas and staircases. People have been climbing this mountain on purpose for a very long time. Taoist pilgrims cut the first stairways into the granite centuries ago, some so steep they are closer to ladders, with names like the Heavenly Stairs and the Black Dragon Ridge, and to this day, porters haul drinking water and instant noodles up those same steps on shoulder poles for the summit shops. Every chain railing on the upper mountain is armored in padlocks, engraved love locks, and red ribbons left by couples and families, tens of thousands of them, a record of everyone who came up here to feel small in the good way. And bolted to the eastern face of that south peak is the reason Dutton flew across the Pacific Ocean. It is called the Changkong Plank Road, the plank walk in the sky, and it was first built by a Taoist priest more than 700 years ago, wooden boards resting on stone pegs driven into a vertical cliff. The modern version runs a little over 300 feet in 3 sections, a chiseled ledge, then a near vertical descent on iron rungs, and then the famous part, a row of wooden planks about 1 foot wide, with the rock face on one side of you and open sky on the other. And remember, it is a dead end. Whoever walks out has to turn around and come back along the same boards. Picture wooden boards about as wide as a laptop bolted to a cliff. And honestly, even that description is underselling it. The mountain knows exactly what it is selling, and it sells it carefully. At the entrance to the plank walk, attendants rent every visitor a shoulder harness for 30 yuan, about $4, with 2 short lanyards and 2 carabiners that clip onto a steel safety cable running the length of the route. The system is simple and strict. You slide both carabiners along as you move, and when you reach an anchor point, or need to get around a person coming the other way, you unclip one, move it past, clip it shut, and only then move the second. One clip is always closed. That is the entire religion of the place. The choreography of passing is the part first-timers never expect. The walk is 2-way traffic on a one-body ledge, so strangers end up chest to chest, negotiating in whatever language works, one person hugging the rock while the other steps around the outside of them over open air. Travelers' accounts are full of small horror stories. A neighbor who unclipped the wrong carabiner by mistake, a teenager filming with both hands, and at the exit, booths will engrave you a souvenir medal for 10 yuan announcing that you survived the plank walk in the sky. The mountain has turned its own danger into the product. The internet calls it the most dangerous hike in the world. And for years, a rumor has floated around that 100 people die on Huashan every year, a number nobody has ever confirmed and the park has never acknowledged. The truth is less cinematic. The mountain's grim reputation comes mostly from its ancient staircases in the decades before railings and cables, while the plank walk itself, with the harness system, has been remarkably controlled. The gear is worn and the operation is informal, but the math only fails when somebody takes themselves out of it. Guides will tell you the cable has worked for years precisely because nobody tests it, the same way a fence works until somebody climbs it, and in all the footage from that route, almost nobody ever had.
2 carabiners stand between every visitor and the bottom of that cliff, and I need you to remember the number 2.
Dutton had been studying that math for a different reason. There is a whole genre on these platforms. Climbers and daredevils hanging one-handed off cranes, sitting on skyscraper ledges, dangling off cliff lips with their feet swinging over nothing, and the numbers on those videos are not normal numbers. His own biggest video, a little over 1 million views, was him hanging off a sandstone edge in Utah with no rope. He knew precisely what the algorithm paid for, and it was not scenery. It was the unprotected human body in places where it should not be. I have watched hundreds of those clips researching these stories, and the cruel part is that the audience is not lying. The views are real, the sponsors are real, the career is real. The internet will happily pay a young man to stand closer and closer to the edge of his own life. It just never discusses the exchange rate.
Dangling off cliffs with no rope built entire careers on that app, and I blame every one of those accounts a little.
The views reward only the risk, never the ride home. Getting there was the easy part, and his vlogs documented all of it. The long haul across the Pacific and the connecting flight into Xi'an with his roommate and cameraman, a quiet 26-year-old named Reed Haggerty. The bullet train to Huashan North Station, barely half an hour. The shuttle bus winding half an hour up the Gorge Road to the West Peak cable car, then the cable car itself, a 20-minute ride over ravines that already had tourists gasping, and then the stone stairways toward the South Peak, through chain railings padlocked with thousands of red prayer ribbons and engraved love locks. They spent the night before in Huayin, the small city at the mountain's feet, in a hostel room with a window that framed the dark mass of the mountain blotting out the stars along the southern sky. Dutton posted a teaser that evening, his face in the dark with the lit cliffs behind him, promising his followers the most dangerous hike on Earth in the morning. Posted through the roaming data on his American phone plan, since the app does not work on Chinese networks, the clip pulled tens of thousands of views while he slept. Reed would tell investigators later, in so many words, that the trip had felt charmed up to that point. Smooth flights, perfect weather, a feed full of people telling his best friend to be careful and not meaning it. By late morning, the two of them were standing in the line for the plank walk, and the line itself is its own warning. Visitors wait on a narrow rock shelf with 2 iron chains for a railing and no harness yet, while everyone who has finished the walk squeezes back through the same bottleneck in the opposite direction. A dropped water bottle rolled past Dutton's boot while they waited, took one bounce, and went off the edge into silence. He filmed it. The caption he added later called it foreshadowing, with a laughing emoji.
Mr. Liang clips thousands of strangers onto that cable every season, and I doubt he ever forgot the one who unclipped himself.
At the front of the line, an attendant, the regulars, called Mr. Liang, had been fitting harnesses on that ledge for years. He cinched the straps across Dutton's chest, clipped both carabiners onto the cable, tugged each one twice, and gave the safety speech he gives hundreds of times a day, half in Mandarin, half in gestures, pointing at the clips, holding up one finger, then shaking his head with 2 fingers raised, one at a time, never both. Dutton nodded along, smiled for his own camera, and said something for the vlog about how the man took his job seriously. The first section eases you in, a chiseled ledge with an iron fence where everyone laughs a little too loudly. Then comes the descent, 30 feet of iron rungs hammered straight down the rock where the laughing stops and people climb down facing the cliff, clip by clip, hands going white on the chains. And then you step sideways onto the planks themselves, and the planet simply ends. 1 foot of weathered wood, polished smooth by decades of shuffling sneakers, the granite wall pressed against your shoulder, and below your heels, a drop of nearly 1,000 feet before the cliff even begins to lean back. People describe their first step onto that wood in religious terms. Knees refusing orders, hands moving on their own, and a strange tunnel quiet. The murmur of the queue gone, only wind and breath left.
His first run across those planks was completely by the book, and I wish with everything that he had just stopped there.
One safe, beautiful video was already sitting on that phone. Dutton's first pass, the one almost nobody talks about, was flawless. He went out midday with the crowds. both carabiners singing along the cable, GoPro in his teeth half the time, and did everything right. He shuffled sideways like everyone else, pressed his chest to the rock when oncoming hikers passed, moved one clip at a time around every anchor, waited his turn at the famous corner where the boards bend around the cliff. Reed filmed him from behind. The footage was beautiful. The mountain had handed him a perfectly good video. They ate instant noodles on the South Peak afterward, and Dutton scrubbed through the clips with his thumb, and the people who were with him that day say his face just slowly closed down. It looked, he said, in so many words, like every other Huashan video ever posted. Same planks, same harness, same nervous grin. There were already 100,000 of those online, filmed by Chinese tourists for Douyin, the version of the app that actually works inside China, and by every backpacker who had come through with a GoPro since the route got famous. He scrolled the mountain's hashtag right there at the table, hundreds of identical thumbnails, and the people with him remember him saying, in so many words, that being one of 100,000 was worse than never coming at all. That review session on the summit is the moment I would freeze if I could. The safe video was already on the phone. The trip was already paid for. The mountain was already conquered. His mother was already going to see it. Every single thing he came for existed by noon. What happened next was not about getting the shot. It was about getting a shot nobody else had.
Reading a comment section can do more damage than any cliff, and I mean the comments daring him to lose the rope.
His plan crystallized over that lunch, and Reed would later describe arguing against it for an hour, in so many words, and losing. They would wait until late afternoon, when the tour groups thinned out and the light went gold, and go back out a second time. Out near the far end of the planks, where the cable sags between anchors and the cliff swallows the sound, Dutton would hand his phone to Reed, and he would do the thing his comment section had been daring him to do for 2 years. He would take the harness out of the picture. Reed's side of that argument deserves to be remembered, because he made every point a safety officer would have made. He said the harness could be cropped, blurred, edited around. He said the comment section would dare him right up to the edge and then post crying emojis afterward. He said the difference between this stunt and the Utah one was that Utah had a ledge 4 feet down. And then he ran into the wall every friend of every creator runs into, which is that you cannot clip an adult to a cable against his will, and being there with him felt safer than letting him come back alone with a tripod. A few minutes past 4:30, roughly an hour before the route stopped admitting people for the day, they were back at the entrance, paying 30 yuan each for the second time that day. The ledge was nearly empty now. Mister. Liang fitted the straps again, and the people behind them in line that afternoon remember him being slower about it the second time, looking at the camera rig, looking at Dutton's face, repeating the gesture with the 2 raised fingers and the shake of the head. There is no rule against walking the planks twice, and there was no rule against most of what was about to happen, because nobody had ever needed one.
Going back for a second pass near closing time tells me everything. He wanted that walkway quiet and nobody watching.
They worked their way out past the corner, past a pair of hikers heading home, to the stretch Dutton had scouted on the first pass, a quiet run of boards near the route's far end, with clean rock above and nothing below but evening haze. The sun was dropping toward the ridgelines to the west, and the cliff had turned the color of honey. Reed braced himself against the wall a few feet away, both his own carabiners locked, and started recording. Dutton looked into the lens and talked for a minute about fear being a choice. The escalation was gradual, which is the part that haunts the people who study accidents like this. First, he sat down on the edge of the planks, boots hanging over the void, both clips still closed, and that alone was a frame most creators would have flown home happy with. Then he leaned back on his palms. Then he asked Reed whether the lanyards were visible in the shot. They were. Of course they were. That is the entire point of them. 2 bright slings running from his chest to the cable-like seatbelts in a car commercial.
Passing another hiker means one clip comes off for a moment, and believe me, the second is never supposed to open.
So, he unclipped one. Click, off the cable, and he tucked the lanyard back over his shoulder, out of the frame. One carabiner still held him, which technically kept him inside the system. The same single-clip state every hiker passes through for a few seconds at every anchor point. He checked the frame again. The remaining slings still cut across the bottom of the shot, one thin line of webbing between this video and the million-view video, between looking brave and being brave. Reed told him in so many words that it looked fine. Dutton did not agree. What he wanted has a name in that corner of the internet. The free solo look. No rope, no rail, no strap, just a human being. And the air. The grammar of the most viral climbing footage ever shot. Audiences scroll past safety the way they scroll past ads. Dutton knew his comment section by heart, knew the exact phrases waiting under a harnessed video, knew the difference in the numbers, and out there on the boards, with the light perfect and the planks to themselves, all of that knowledge weighed more than the cable did.
Authenticity is the word he used for removing his own lifeline, and I've hated that word ever since.
The harness ruined the shot. That was his entire reasoning. At 7 minutes past 5 in the evening, the second carabiner came off the cable. Reed's voice on the recording goes tight, telling him this part is not worth it, asking him to clip back in, and Dutton answers the way he always answered, easy, unbothered, saying in so many words that he had climbed harder things in flip-flops, that he needed 30 seconds, that the grip was good, both lanyards were tucked behind his shoulders now. On the screen of the phone, he looked exactly like what he was pretending to be, a man on a cliff with nothing holding him because nothing was. Reed has talked about those next minutes exactly once to the police, and his account is the spine of everything we know. He stayed clipped, back against the granite, the phone in one hand and his other hand free on purpose, he said, in case. He remembers deciding that the fastest way to end the stunt was to film it well, no retakes, one clean shot, and then everybody clips in and goes down the mountain for dumplings. He remembers the wind being almost nothing. He remembers thinking the light really was perfect and hating himself for thinking it.
Both carabiners hanging open on his chest meant nothing on that mountain was holding him anymore, and it kind of makes me sick.
Then, he did the thing he had flown 8,000 miles to do. He turned to face the mountain, knelt down on the boards, took the worn front edge of the planks in both hands, and lowered his body off the walkway until he hung at full extension over the east face of the South Peak, arms straight, feet swimming gently above 1,000 feet of nothing. He looked up into the lens and grinned. On the recording, you can hear Reed breathing. Somewhere down the route, a woman who saw it later told police she assumed it was a mannequin, because no person would do that. One other person saw what happened next. A hiker from Chengdu was resting at the corner where the boards bend, close enough to see but too far to matter, and she stood frozen with both hands on the cable. Far below them, birds were cutting through the evening air against the cliff face, which is the detail she could not stop repeating to officers afterward, that there were birds flying beneath a human being's shoes. The attendant station was out of sight around the rock. There was nobody on that mountain with the authority or the reach to stop what was already in motion.
Hanging by your fingers above 1,000 feet of air for a phone is a trade I'll never understand.
Here is what was happening inside his hands during those seconds, because this is where the story was always going to be decided. A dead hang looks static, but it is a countdown. Forearm muscles locked in a closed fist burn through their fuel astonishingly fast, and the burn arrives quietly, a warmth, then a tremble, then a strange distance, like the fingers belong to someone else. The boards he gripped were not a gym bar. They were hand-worn wood, rounded at the lip, faintly gritty with dust, and his palms had been sweating since the second carabiner opened. On the recording, the hang lasts 26 seconds, and the people who have seen it say you can watch the transaction happen in his face. Second 5, the grin, the eyebrow raise, the money shot already banked. Second 12, the grin tightens at the corners as the forearms send their first invoice. Second 18, his feet stop swinging and go still, the body instinctively cutting every gram of wasted motion. And Reed's voice says, "Come up now," twice, no longer sounding like a cameraman. Second 20, Dutton starts the pull. That was supposed to be routine.
Grip strength fails quietly, not loudly, and I knew his forearms were on a countdown the second he lowered himself.
Forearms do not negotiate, they just quit. 20 seconds in, he started to pull back up, and the pull-up that had never once failed him in his life failed him for the first time in the one place it could not. His elbows bent, his chin reached the level of the planks, and then his right hand, repositioning for a higher hold on the smooth edge, slid. The recording shows his whole body drop 3 inches and catch on one arm. The grin disappeared. What replaced it, frame by frame, was the expression of a man doing arithmetic he had never planned to do, with numbers that were already finished. Pull-ups in a gym are nothing like one pull-up over a void, and I could feel his arms giving out from here. Reed moved faster than thinking. He dropped to the boards on his knees, still clipped, and lunged for the wrist that was still holding, and his fingers closed on the cuff of Dutton's jacket sleeve. For 1/2 of 1 second, there was a connection between them, nylon and fingertips, 26 years old holding 25 years old above the bottom of the world. Then, the fabric pulled through. Anyone who has studied falls will tell you that no grip in the world arrests a falling adult by a jacket cuff. It did not matter. Reed will measure that half second for the rest of his life.
Reed got 2 fingers on his friend's sleeve, and that half second is something I wouldn't wish on anyone.
At 11 minutes past 5 in the evening, Dutton Stuckey came off the plank walk in the sky. There was no scream on the recording. The witnesses all said the same impossible thing, that it happened in complete silence. Just the shape of him dropping away from the boards and growing smaller against the granite until the east face of the south peak took him out of view. He fell nearly 1,000 feet to the first broken terraces of the cliff. Nobody on that mountain could reach him, and no fall of that height leaves anything for a rescuer to do. He was gone before the echo of Reed's shout came back off the rock. Silence is what every witness on those planks described next, and I have thought about that lack of sound for weeks. The attendants cleared and closed the plank walk within minutes, and scenic area police led Reed, still clipped to the cable and unable to stand, back along the boards he had just watched his best friend leave. A recovery team reached the body at first light the next morning, far below, where the cliff finally relents into broken slopes, and the American embassy in Beijing was notified that day. His family in Arizona learned what had happened before most of his followers did. The final video was never posted. Reed handed the phone to the police, and as far as anyone knows, the footage has never left their evidence room. Huashan did not change after Dutton died, because it did not need to. The cable was there, the rules were there, Mr. Liang's 2 raised fingers were there, and every one of them had done its job until the moment a healthy young man methodically removed himself from all of it for a camera. What changed was the argument. Chinese outlets pointed to the country's tourist blacklist system and asked why stunt creators were still being let onto sites like this at all, and his own industry asked it too, quieter, between tributes. His account is still up. The pinned video, the one with 1 million views, is him hanging off an edge by his hands.
Banning influencers from places like this gets debated every time someone dies, and I finally understand both sides of it. The mountain kept its rules. He was the one who left them. It was the 8th of April, 2026 in Yosemite National Park, California. The morning at Glacier Point was clear with light winds and long visibility across Yosemite Valley and surrounding granite formations. By late afternoon, the overlook was crowded, with visitors moving between marked viewpoints and unprotected granite edges dropping into steep cliffs without barriers or railings. Elvis Amore, age 24, was a recent business school graduate from Dallas, Texas. He was traveling through western United States national parks on a post-graduation road trip that had been planned over several months. The trip was structured around stops intended for personal documentation and social media content. He was physically fit and comfortable with long-distance walking, but had limited experience in high-elevation environments where terrain changes, slope, and edge exposure are not always visually obvious. At Glacier Point, he carried a phone-mounted recording device and moved between multiple vantage points along the overlook. His activity consisted primarily of filming short clips, adjusting framing, and reviewing recorded footage. Over time, he kind of drifted away from the main viewing spots and ended up in these quieter patches of granite closer to the edge. The ground there still looked flat at first glance, but it actually had these small, subtle slopes that slowly pulled you toward the rim without you really noticing a clear point where it changed. As the afternoon progressed, he began recording a sequence while walking backward and filming himself. The movement required continuous attention to the screen while stepping without visual confirmation of the terrain behind him. He maintained a steady pace, periodically checking the device to adjust framing and positioning. His path crossed onto a section of granite, where the slope subtly increased toward the overlook edge, reducing natural braking from friction and foot placement. He continued moving backward across this sloped surface. At several points, minor adjustments in footing were required to maintain balance, particularly as the terrain transitioned from flatter granite to slightly rounded rock. These changes were not marked or clearly distinguishable from surrounding surfaces, and there were no physical barriers indicating proximity to the edge. I'll be honest, watching someone drift that close to the rim without really looking up from the screen never really feels dramatic in the moment. It just looks like someone lining up another take. Near the rim, he stepped onto a smoother, slightly convex section of granite. At the same time, his attention remained directed toward the recording device. Investigators later noted that his final steps occurred without direct visual confirmation of the ground behind him. He took another backward step that placed his foot near the edge of the stable surface. The combination of slope, reduced friction, and rearward movement resulted in a shift in balance that could not be corrected within the available space. His center of gravity moved beyond the edge line of the overlook. Once that occurred, there was no remaining stable surface behind him to recover footing. He fell backward over the edge of Glacier Point. The transition from standing to falling occurred in a short time frame. consistent with a loss of balance near an unprotected drop-off rather than a prolonged descent or attempt to climb or stop the movement. It doesn't look like anything dramatic from the outside, just a step that doesn't land right. After he went over the edge, he basically hit the cliff face right away. The first impacts were against uneven rock just below the rim, and then he kept dropping down along different vertical sections of exposed granite. It didn't really stop or slow in any meaningful way until he eventually reached the lower talus slopes at the base of the cliff system. Visitors in the area observed the movement and reported it immediately after recognizing what had occurred. Some accounts described a brief delay between the loss of footing and realization that a fall had taken place, consistent with the short duration of the event. Emergency services were contacted within minutes, and park response teams were dispatched shortly afterward. Due to the steep terrain and limited access routes beneath Glacier Point, recovery operations required both ground-based search teams and aerial support. The area of impact was not visible from the overlook, and locating the exact position required coordination between multiple units. Operations continued into the following day before personnel reached and secured the location. The official medical examination determined that death resulted from multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a high elevation fall. Investigators found no evidence of foul play, structural failure, or equipment malfunction. The incident was classified as an accidental fall from an unprotected cliff edge. Contributing factors included loss of footing on sloped granite and reduced situational awareness while the subject's attention was directed toward a handheld recording device during movement near the edge. It was the 18th of July, 2017. On that morning, thousands of people would visit Angel's Landing, one of the most famous hikes in America. The trail isn't especially long, but it climbs steeply through a canyon of red and orange sandstone before reaching a narrow ridge high above the valley floor. Most days, hikers leave with tired legs, a few photos, and a story to tell. But this wasn't going to be one of those days. A powerful heat wave had settled over southern Utah, and by afternoon, temperatures were expected to climb well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Janice Norwood, Melissa Whitcomb, and Deanna Ellery had been friends for years and shared the kind of friendship that made traveling together feel easy. They weren't professional adventurers or hardcore hikers chasing records. They were ordinary people who enjoyed getting out, seeing new places, and collecting experiences along the way. Janice, 51, was usually the one who organized things. If a trip needed planning, reservations, or directions, she naturally stepped into that role. She liked having a plan and trusted her ability to make good decisions. Melissa, 43, was the most physically active of the group. She exercised regularly, took pride in staying fit, and rarely saw a challenge she didn't think she could handle. If there was a long walk, a steep climb, or a difficult workout, she was usually the first to volunteer. Deanna, 47, had a story for almost everything. A road trip through the mountains reminded her of another trip. A scenic overlook reminded her of somewhere she'd been years earlier. She loved traveling, and she often measured new experiences against old ones. As I learned more about their adventure, it became clear that Angel's Landing was the highlight of their summer road trip. The trip had started the way a lot of road trips do, with a list of places they wanted to see and far more ideas than time. Over the weeks leading up to their vacation, the three friends had gone back and forth on destinations. There were scenic drives, small towns, overlooks, and national parks scattered across the Southwest. The trail had a reputation that extended far beyond Utah. Even people who had never been there often recognized photos of the towering cliffs, the winding canyon below, and the narrow ridgeline leading toward the summit. It was one of those hikes people seemed to hear about everywhere. For Janice, it looked manageable with enough preparation and common sense. She spent time reading trail descriptions and checking maps, and by the time the trip arrived, she felt she had a pretty good understanding of what to expect. Melissa focused on the physical side of it. The distance didn't seem especially intimidating, and she felt confident she was in better shape than many of the people who would be attempting the hike. Deanna approached it differently. As she looked through photos and articles, she found herself comparing Angel's Landing to places she had already visited. The trail looked impressive, but nothing about it seemed completely outside of what she had experienced before. The forecast wasn't exactly a secret. Temperatures were expected to climb well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but summer heat in the Southwest wasn't unusual, and none of the women saw the forecast as a reason to change their plans.
They packed water, hiking clothes, and the usual essentials, assuming a little extra caution would be enough. The day before the hike, the three friends arrived in southern Utah and got their first real look at the landscape they had spent weeks reading about. Photos had prepared them for the towering cliffs and narrow canyons, but seeing them in person was different. Everywhere they looked, massive walls of red and orange sandstone rose above the valley floor. Even the drive into the area felt like part of the experience. They spent part of the day exploring, taking pictures, and getting their bearings. The hike was scheduled for the following morning, giving them plenty of time to take in the scenery before the main event. The dry air felt noticeably different from what they were used to, and even standing in the afternoon sun for a few minutes could be uncomfortable. The heat was impossible to ignore. The forecast for the following day remained well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but nothing about the conditions seemed especially unusual. Visitors were everywhere, and trails throughout the area remained busy despite the temperature.
The impression I was left with was that they considered the conditions normal for that time of year.
The plan was simple: get some rest, start the hike the next morning, and finally see what all the excitement was about. The next morning started early. By the time Janice, Melissa, and Deanna arrived at the trailhead, plenty of other hikers were already moving in and out of the area. Some were adjusting backpacks, others were checking maps, and a few had clearly started their hikes long before sunrise. The atmosphere felt energetic. People were chatting, taking photos, and getting ready for what many considered the most famous hike in the park. The three friends took a few minutes to get organized before setting off. Janice glanced over the trail information one last time, while Melissa seemed eager to get moving after the early start. Deanna spent a few moments taking in the scenery around them. Warning signs reminded hikers about the dangers of heat, dehydration, and strenuous physical activity, especially during the summer months. Melissa said that if she listened to every warning sign on the trail, she'd never make it out of the parking lot. Even in the morning, the temperature was climbing quickly. The sun had already cleared the canyon walls, and there was little cloud cover to provide relief later in the day. Still, conditions seemed manageable. People were heading up the trail in a steady stream, and there was no obvious reason to believe the hike would be anything other than challenging and memorable. With their supplies packed and their route decided, the three women headed toward the trail and joined the growing line of hikers making their way into the canyon. The first stretch of the hike got off to a good start. The trail was busy but not crowded, and the morning air was still comfortable despite the forecast for later in the day. The path wound through the canyon as towering sandstone walls rose around them, creating the kind of scenery that made people stop every few minutes just to look around. The pace was relaxed, conversation came easily, and there was no shortage of things to talk about.
Like many first-time visitors, the three friends frequently paused to admire the views or point out features in the landscape that looked even more impressive in person than they had in photographs.
The climb required effort, but nothing felt unusual. The trail was unfolding much the way Janice had expected from the maps and descriptions she had studied beforehand. Melissa appeared completely comfortable with the physical demands of the hike and rarely seemed out of breath. Diana found herself comparing the scenery to places she had visited on previous trips, though she admitted there was something different about the sheer scale of the canyon around them. The weather remained clear, the trail conditions were good, and the destination they had been looking forward to for weeks felt a little closer with every step. As the morning went on, the trail gradually became more demanding. The elevation gain was steady enough that nobody really noticed it at first, but after a while, the climb started making itself known. Conversations became a little more spread out, and the pauses between them lasted a bit longer, not because anyone was struggling, but because more attention was being spent on the trail itself. The crowds also began to thin out. Some hikers moved ahead at a faster pace, while others stopped frequently to rest or take photographs. Janice, Melissa, and Diana settled into a rhythm that worked for them. They weren't rushing, but they weren't lingering for long either. Whenever they stopped, Melissa was usually the first one ready to start moving again. The higher they climbed, the wider the views became. Sections of the canyon that had looked enormous from below now seemed surprisingly distant. Looking back down the trail,
I could tell it was the kind of progress that felt satisfying because you could actually see how far they'd come.
By now, the morning air was beginning to lose some of its coolness. The sun felt stronger than it had an hour earlier, and shaded areas became a little more noticeable whenever the trail passed through them. Nobody paid much attention to that yet. Their focus remained on the climb ahead and the views surrounding them.
I could see that the climb was getting harder, but at that point, the scenery was more than making up for it.
By mid-morning, roughly 2 hours into the hike, the trail had started revealing a different side of itself. The scenery was still impressive, but the conditions were becoming harder to ignore. Long stretches of the route often offered little protection from the sun, and some sections felt noticeably warmer than others. The canyon walls no longer blocked as much sunlight as they had earlier in the morning, leaving more of the trail exposed. The women weren't the only ones noticing it. Hikers coming back down often looked far more tired than those still heading up. Many were carrying empty or nearly empty water bottles, and quite a few stopped whenever they found a patch of shade. Some rested for only a few minutes before continuing. Others seemed reluctant to leave the cooler spots at all. When a younger group mentioned turning around because of the heat, Janice commented that she would have expected people their age to handle the conditions a little better. Along the trail, reminders about heat and hydration appeared more than once.
The message was simple. Summer conditions could become dangerous faster than many people expected, because in the dry desert air, it wasn't always easy to tell how much water your body was losing.
During one of their brief stops, all three women lingered in the shade a little longer than they had earlier that morning. For now, however, the hike continued much as it had before. The trail remained busy, the views remained spectacular, and the summit still felt well within reach. By this point, the hike was demanding more from them than it had earlier in the morning. Nothing dramatic had happened, and nobody felt particularly concerned, but the effort was beginning to add up. The combination of climbing, direct sunlight, and steadily rising temperatures was turning what had started as a comfortable walk into something that required a little more attention. Water was disappearing faster than any of them had expected. Each time they stopped, bottles came out almost automatically. A quick drink became part of every break. What surprised them wasn't how thirsty they felt, but how often they felt it. Even after drinking, the relief didn't seem to last very long. None of them viewed that as a warning sign.
It's as if it felt like a normal response to a hot hike to them, at least from what I could tell.
The dry desert air made it easy to overlook just how much fluid they were losing. The heat seemed to pull moisture away gradually, one sip of water at a time. The trail remained busy, though the mood felt slightly different now. More hikers were resting when they found shade. Water bottles appeared in almost every hand. Conversations that had been lively earlier in the morning were becoming quieter. Nobody was treating the conditions like an emergency, but there were growing signs that people were starting to respect the heat a little more than they had at the beginning of the day. As they continued climbing, the trail itself began demanding more attention. Earlier sections had felt relatively forgiving, but now there were fewer places to comfortably stop and recover. More of the route sat fully exposed to the sun, with the surrounding sandstone reflecting heat back onto the trail. The physical effort wasn't dramatically different from before, but it felt more constant. The women found themselves focusing less on the scenery and more on the next stretch of trail ahead. Breaks became slightly more practical than leisurely.
Instead of stopping to simply admire the landscape, they were increasingly using those pauses to catch their breath, drink some water, and give their legs a chance to recover.
Melissa still seemed eager to maintain momentum whenever the group stopped, though even she was spending a little more time resting than she had earlier in the morning. Janice occasionally checked their progress against what she remembered from the trail information she had read beforehand. Deanna continued pointing out similarities to other places she had visited, but those observations were becoming less frequent as the climb required more of her attention. They had already covered a significant portion of the hike by this point, but getting farther now required more effort than any of them had expected. Shortly before noon, the three friends found a place to stop for a longer break. By then, they had been hiking for several hours, and the opportunity to sit down for a few minutes was welcome. Water bottles were passed around, snacks came out, and for the first time that day, there was no immediate rush to continue moving. The stop indeed seemed to help. After spending a few minutes off their feet, everyone appeared noticeably more comfortable than they had while climbing. Breathing slowed, legs recovered, and the fatigue that had been building throughout the morning no longer seemed quite as obvious. Around them, other hikers were doing much the same thing, taking advantage of any chance to rest before continuing farther up the trail. For Janice, the break reinforced the idea that they were managing the hike well. Melissa looked refreshed after sitting down for a while, and Diana appeared far more interested in the scenery again than she had been during the previous stretch of climbing.
At that point, I don't think they saw the discomfort as anything more than a temporary issue.
When they eventually stood up and continued hiking, there was little to suggest that the rest of the day would be any different.
If anything, I got the sense that the break left them more confident than they had been when they first sat down.
The longer the hike went on, the more each of the women started interpreting the conditions in her own way. Nobody was arguing, and there was no dramatic conflict within the group, but they weren't necessarily seeing the trail through the same lens anymore. Janice remained focused on the overall progress they were making. To her, they were still moving at a reasonable pace and covering ground steadily. The hike was certainly more demanding than it had been earlier in the morning, but nothing about it struck her as unusual.
To someone like me looking in from the outside, Janice appeared unfazed by the added difficulty.
Melissa viewed things differently. Her attention stayed fixed on the physical challenge itself. When another hiker mentioned slowing down because of the heat, Melissa responded by saying that most people quit long before they actually reached their limits. The climb had become tiring, but she treated that as something to work through rather than something to worry about. Diana continued drawing comparisons to previous trips. If another hiker mentioned difficult conditions, Diana usually had a story about a trip she considered even tougher. Some hikes had been steeper, others had been longer. A few had taken place in conditions she remembered as being just as uncomfortable.
Her thinking back on those experiences, it made me realize that the challenges of the day probably felt familiar to her rather than concerning.
None of these viewpoints seemed unreasonable on their own. If anything, they helped explain why the three friends remained confident. Each woman had her own explanation for why the hike still felt manageable, and together, those explanations made it easier to keep moving forward. As noon approached, the character of the hike began changing again. The sun was now high overhead, and much of the trail sat fully exposed beneath it. Areas that had seemed merely warm earlier in the morning now felt noticeably hotter. The canyon still looked spectacular, but fewer people were stopping simply to admire the view. Looking back over the course of the morning, the difference was obvious. Rest stops were lasting a little longer, water breaks were becoming more frequent, conversations that had once filled much of the hike now appeared only in shorter bursts between stretches of walking. The three friends were experiencing the same changes. Janice spent less time talking about the route and more time focusing on the trail immediately ahead. Melissa was still maintaining a steady pace, but the effortless energy she had shown earlier was beginning to fade. Deanna had become quieter as well, saving most of her comments for moments when the group stopped to rest. Around them, other hikers seemed to be adjusting in similar ways. More people were seeking out whatever cover they could find. Small patches of shade that might have gone unnoticed earlier in the day were now occupied almost immediately whenever they appeared. Nobody seemed alarmed, but there was a growing sense that the conditions deserved more respect than they had that morning. By this point, they were much closer to their destination than they were to the trailhead. They had already invested hours into the climb and covered a significant portion of the route. Turning around remained an option, but it was no longer the option most people naturally thought about first. The afternoon heat had now settled in completely. Whatever relief the morning had offered was gone. The trail, the surrounding rock, and the air itself all seemed to radiate warmth. Even when the group stopped moving, there was little sense of cooling off. Rest breaks still helped, but the effects didn't seem to last as long as they had earlier in the day. Hours of climbing were beginning to make themselves known. Standing up after a break took a little more effort than before. Legs felt heavier. Recovery came more slowly. None of those things seemed unusual on their own, but together, they were changing the pace of the hike. The destination remained important, but more attention was being spent on the next section of trail than on the summit itself. Janice continued checking their progress whenever she could. Melissa still pushed herself to keep a steady pace, even if it required more effort than it had that morning. Deanna found herself taking longer to settle back into a rhythm after each stop, though she mostly kept those frustrations to herself. Around them, the mood on the trail had changed noticeably from the energy of the morning. Conversations were shorter. Hikers spent more time watching their footing and less time admiring the scenery. Nobody appeared panicked or alarmed, but there was a growing sense that the day was becoming more demanding than many people had expected. At some point during a long hike, the destination starts feeling closer than the starting point, even when that's not technically true. Janice, Melissa, and Deanna had already spent hours on the trail and covered a significant amount of ground.
The way I saw it, they had already committed so much energy and time to the climb that continuing forward just felt easier than giving up.
The heat had become a constant presence. Water breaks still happened regularly, but the relief never seemed to last for very long. Within minutes of starting again, the warmth and fatigue would return. Janice saw no reason to abandon the plan now. Melissa treated the growing discomfort as something to push through. Deanna reminded herself that difficult stretches were part of almost every memorable trip she had ever taken. To anyone passing by, the three women would have looked like countless other hikers spending a hot day on a demanding trail. Tired, certainly. Uncomfortable, perhaps, but not yet in obvious trouble. The effects of the day were becoming harder to hide. Janice was the first to show signs that something was changing. She seemed slightly more distracted than usual and occasionally needed a moment to reorient herself when checking the route ahead. It wasn't enough to alarm anyone, and she largely brushed it off as fatigue from several hours of hiking. Melissa was dealing with her own problems. The steady pace she had maintained throughout most of the day was becoming harder to sustain. Her legs felt heavier, and occasional muscle tightness appeared whenever the group stopped and started again. She continued pushing forward, treating it as part of the challenge. Diana had grown noticeably quieter. The stories and comparisons to previous trips had mostly stopped, replaced by a growing focus on simply keeping pace with the group. She found herself lingering a little longer during breaks before getting back on her feet. Still, none of the three women considered turning around. The trail was demanding nearly all of their attention now. Long stretches passed without much conversation as the three women focused on the climb. Rest stops were becoming more frequent, and getting back on their feet no longer felt automatic. Janice seemed unusually distracted, occasionally pausing as if she had lost her train of thought. Melissa continued pushing herself forward, but the breaks between stops were growing shorter. Deanna spent longer sitting during rests and appeared far less interested in the scenery than she had been earlier in the day. Other hikers were beginning to notice. A few glanced over as the group stopped again, while others lingered nearby before continuing on. The three women no longer blended into the crowd the way they had that morning. The next time the group stopped, it became clear that Janice was struggling. She appeared confused and had difficulty focusing on simple tasks that would normally have required little thought. Nearby hikers began paying closer attention as she took longer than expected to gather herself and get moving again. When the group eventually continued, Janice's condition worsened. She seemed unsteady on her feet and noticeably less aware of her surroundings. After only a short distance, she stumbled, lost her balance, and collapsed on the trail. The situation changed immediately. Hikers nearby moved in to help while someone placed an emergency call. As attention turned toward Janice, it became clear that Melissa and Diana were having problems of their own. Melissa was struggling to remain on her feet after stops, while Diana appeared increasingly weak and spent more time sitting than standing. What had started as concern for a single hiker quickly became a medical emergency involving all three women. With little shade available and temperatures still above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the group remained exposed while waiting for help to arrive. The emergency call brought help into motion, but reaching the group was never going to be quick. The trail's terrain, the afternoon heat, and the location of the hikers all created delays. While assistance made its way toward them, nearby hikers continued doing what they could to help and monitor the three women. Janice remained in critical condition. Melissa and Deanna were also struggling as the effects of hours spent in extreme heat continued to overwhelm their bodies. The wait felt long, and the conditions that had contributed to the emergency were still present around them. By the time help reached the scene, the situation had become extremely difficult to reverse. Despite extensive efforts to save them, Janice Norwood, Melissa Whitcomb, and Diana Ellery all died from heat-related medical emergencies brought on by prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures and dehydration. Investigators pieced together the timeline using phone records, time-stamped photographs, witness accounts, and location data recovered from the group's devices. Those records showed that the three women had spent hours hiking in extreme heat as temperatures climbed well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They also revealed a gradual slowdown in pace as the day progressed, matching the accounts provided by hikers who encountered them on the trail. The findings identified heat-related illness as the primary factor in all three deaths. Janice suffered severe heat stroke after prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures. Melissa died from exertional heat stroke after continuing to hike as conditions worsened. Deanna experienced a heat-related medical emergency complicated by dehydration and pre-existing cardiovascular risk factors. The outcome was ultimately linked to a combination of extreme heat, prolonged exposure, physical exertion, and the decision to continue despite worsening conditions. What struck me most was that their hike ended as a reminder that in the desert, even ordinary decisions can carry serious consequences when temperatures push beyond what the human body can safely handle. It was the 21st of May, 2026. The Taft Point overlook was dry and clear, with steady visitor traffic across open granite near the rim, overlooking a steep, unprotected drop of several hundred feet. The exposed surface stretched wide and uninterrupted, with visitors naturally spreading out along the edge to take in the valley views. I've been to Taft Point in similar conditions. It always feels calm right up until you remember how unprotected the edge actually is. That kind of openness messes with depth perception more than people expect. Cisco Polizzi, age 38, a high school science teacher from Fresno, California, was an experienced but self-directed backpacker who often organized short wilderness trips. He was used to moderate loads on uneven terrain, but for this hike, he carried a heavier pack than usual
including camera equipment and additional supplies added shortly before departure. The load was functional but unevenly distributed due to items stored in outer compartments. He began the hike at a steady pace, making small adjustments to the pack as the weight shifted with elevation. These adjustments were minor at first and did not affect his stability. As the route opened into exposed granite near Taft Point, movement became less structured and small balance shifts became more noticeable. By the time he reached the overlook, visitor density had increased. Groups moved between informal viewing positions near the rim, often pausing to take photos of the valley below. Cisco joined them, spending extended time near the edge while framing shots and adjusting his stance to compensate for the pack's uneven feel. I've seen plenty of hikers do this part almost on autopilot, camera up, feet adjusting without real awareness of how close they are to getting to the rim. Observers later noted repeated minor strap adjustments and subtle weight shifts from side to side. The backpack responded with slight lateral sway during forward lean or rotation, indicating a persistent imbalance that required constant correction. As he moved closer to the rim to improve his camera angle, he stepped into a narrower section of exposed granite where footing required more deliberate placement. At the same time, he adjusted or accessed equipment stored on the outside of his backpack, briefly shifting how the load rested across his shoulders. This did not meaningfully alter his overall balance on its own. However, it occurred during a moment where he was already leaning forward and rotating his torso for a shot, which reduced his stability margin near the edge. He made a small corrective adjustment to recenter his posture while standing near the edge. That movement required precise footing on smooth granite, where traction can vary depending on angle and pressure. At the same time, his available space for a recovery step behind him was limited by his proximity to the rim, reducing how much he could safely shift backward. With his feet already positioned close to the edge of the overlook, there was limited usable space behind him to naturally step back into stability. Instead of a full recovery step, the movement became more of a partial shift in weight, where his upper body moved faster than his feet could properly re-anchor. During that adjustment, his balance shifted into a position that was difficult to recover from given the limited space available behind him. With little room to step back and re-establish footing, his ability to correct the movement was significantly reduced. At that point, further adjustments were no longer sufficient to regain stable balance in time. Witnesses nearby described the motion as a sudden backward loss of balance rather than a controlled step or push. Because of his proximity to the edge, there was insufficient time for nearby visitors to react or close the distance before he passed the rim. He dropped several hundred feet down the vertical face of Taft Point. The descent involved multiple impacts against protruding rock surfaces and ledges along the cliff wall, with his trajectory changing repeatedly before continuing into lower sections of exposed granite and talus near the base. I've seen enough of these cliffside recoveries to know the fall itself is only part of the problem. The terrain does most of the work afterward. Emergency calls were placed within minutes by visitors in the area who had witnessed the fall. Some initially hesitated, confirming what they had seen due to the speed of the event and the difficulty of tracking movement over the cliff edge. Park personnel and search and rescue teams were dispatched shortly afterward, initiating a technical response due to the steep and inaccessible terrain below the overlook. Recovery operations required rope systems and coordinated descent from a safer access point, as direct approach from above was not possible. Conditions along the cliff face, including loose rock and uneven ledges, slowed progress for responders. Cisco was located later in a lower section of the cliff environment, well below the primary viewing area. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from multiple blunt force injuries sustained during the fall and repeated impacts against the rock face. Investigators found no evidence of foul play, structural failure, or environmental collapse at the overlook. The official conclusion noted that a combination of factors, including proximity to the cliff edge, body positioning during photography, and load management of carried equipment, contributed to the loss of balance and fall. No structural or environmental failures were identified at the overlook. It was the 6th of July 2019, and the Happy Isles trailhead in Yosemite National Park was already busy by 6 a.m., despite a heat advisory that had been in effect since Thursday. The forecast high for Yosemite Valley that day was 108 degrees Fahrenheit. At elevation on the exposed granite sections of the trail, where the rock absorbs direct sun for hours, surface temperatures would climb past 140 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. Half Dome is one of the most iconic hikes in the United States, a roughly 1/6-mile round trip with nearly 5,000 feet of elevation gain that ends with a steep cable-assisted climb up a granite face so exposed that Park Service posts explicit warnings about the dangers of the final ascent. The cables themselves are metal poles drilled into the rock with steel cables strung between them. The last 400 feet of the hike requires pulling yourself up a granite slope that pitches roughly 40 to 45 degrees, with nothing but those cables and your grip strength between you and a fall that would end everything. In summer heat, the steel cables absorb solar radiation all day, and by afternoon the metal surface can exceed 140 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to blister skin on contact. Since 2010, the park has required permits for the cable section because overcrowding was creating dangerous conditions, limiting access to approximately 225-day hikers plus permitted backpackers. Every permit comes with safety information about weather, heat exposure, and the physical demands of the hike, which is basically the park telling you how this can go wrong. Gretchen Landis was 49 years old and lived in a suburb outside of Phoenix. She worked in pharmaceutical sales and had spent the previous 18 months building what she described to friends as her outdoors phase. This basically included a handful of moderate day hikes around Sedona and Camelback Mountain, a guided walk along the Grand Canyon's south rim, and a growing Instagram account where she posted trail selfies with captions about finding herself in nature. The photos were polished, the gear was expensive, and the trails were all manageable for anyone in average shape. She had accumulated roughly 4,000 followers, mostly friends, coworkers, and women in similar demographics. The identity felt real to Gretchen, because honestly, nobody in her audience had the experience to tell her it wasn't. The trails Gretchen was used to in Phoenix were hot, but they were also short, well-maintained, and never more than a 15-minute drive from an air-conditioned car. If something went wrong, you could call for help, and someone would reach you within the hour. Half Dome was 16 miles in a granite canyon, with no cell service above Nevada Fall, no vehicle access, and no quick way out once you pass the halfway point. The heat was comparable, but the infrastructure was not. Her friend Tammy Salcedo was 47 and lived in the same development. Tammy was less fit than Gretchen and less interested in the outdoors brand Gretchen was building, but she had been pulled into the orbit of Gretchen's enthusiasm over the previous year. They had hiked Camelback together twice. Tammy found both experiences difficult but manageable, though she privately told her husband after the second one that she genuinely didn't understand why Gretchen treated it like a major accomplishment. She trusted Gretchen's assessment that the progression from Camelback to Half Dome was reasonable because Gretchen said it with the confidence of someone who had done the research. She had not done the research. It pretty much wasn't. Camelback Mountain is a 5-mile round trip with 1,300 feet of elevation gain. Half Dome is over 6 times longer with nearly 4 times the elevation. The comparison was kind of like running a 5K and deciding you were ready for a marathon.
What gets me about these two right from the start is Gretchen had basically built this whole identity around being outdoorsy without ever testing it against anything that could push back. Half Dome was kind of the first trail in her life that was gonna have an opinion about whether she belonged there or not.
That was going to have an opinion about whether she belonged there? The trip was planned primarily around content. Gretchen had told her followers she was attempting Half Dome and framed it as her biggest challenge yet. She had bought new hiking boots like 2 weeks before the trip and broken them in on a single 3-mile walk around her neighborhood. She packed a 2 0-ounce water bottle and a second one she planned to fill at the trailhead. For a 1 6-mile hike in July in Yosemite during a heat advisory, experienced hikers recommend a minimum of 1 gallon per person, roughly 128 ounces. Gretchen had roughly 40. Neither woman brought electrolyte supplements, sun protection beyond a baseball cap, or lightweight gloves for the cables. Tammy's preparation was similar. She brought 2 small water bottles, a granola bar, a banana, and wore trail running shoes she had purchased for their appearance rather than their traction. Neither woman brought a first aid kit or any form of water filtration for refilling along the trail. Neither had studied the route beyond looking at photos of the cable section on Instagram. There was also the matter of the permit. Half Dome cable permits are distributed through a lottery system months in advance and are limited to a few hundred permitted hikers per day. Gretchen and Tammy did not have permits. Gretchen had applied for the daily lottery twice, been rejected both times, and decided that the permit system was what she described to Tammy in a text as basically just a suggestion. Her plan was to basically hike to the subdome and talk her way past whoever was stationed there, or just wait until the ranger was busy and go around.
I'm not gonna sugarcoat this one. The permanent system exists because people literally died on that route when it got overcrowded. Treating it like something you can just charm your way past is genuinely one of the most dangerous attitudes you can bring onto a trail like this.
They arrived at the trailhead at approximately 9:40 a.m., roughly 3 to 4 hours later than most experienced Half Dome hikers begin. The standard advice is to start before dawn and be off the exposed sections before the heat of the day. Because in summer, Yosemite's granite absorbs solar energy from the moment the sun clears the valley walls, and by afternoon, the rock becomes a radiator that cooks a person from below while the sun cooks them from above. During heat advisories, rangers treat this advice less like a recommendation and more like the difference between hiking and heat stroke. They had trouble finding parking in the valley and ended up taking the shuttle to the trailhead, pushing their actual start to closer to 10 a.m. A ranger at the trailhead spoke with several groups that morning about the heat advisory. She later stated she had an interaction with 2 women matching Gretchen and Tammy's description, in which she warned about the dangerous heat and told them they needed significantly more water. The response, according to the ranger, was dismissive. One of the women said something along the lines of them being from Phoenix, so they were used to the heat.
Phoenix heat and Half Dome heat are not the same thing, and honestly the fact that I have to say that out loud tells you everything about how Gretchen processed risk.
The trail to Half Dome via the Mist Trail passes Vernal Fall and then Nevada Fall, climbing steep granite steps physically demanding even for fit hikers. Gretchen and Tammy moved slowly from the start. Their pace, later estimated by investigators from photographs, social media timestamps, and witness accounts, averaged roughly 1.5 miles per hour on flat sections and significantly less on steep terrain. For reference, the average hiking pace on moderate terrain is 2 to 3 miles per hour, so they were pretty much behind from the start. The thing about the Half Dome Trail that most visitors never account for is the heat shift. The Mist Trail has shade and spray from the waterfalls, so the first couple miles feel cooler than conditions actually are. But once you pass Nevada Fall, the tree cover thins and the trail crosses long stretches of exposed granite that has been absorbing direct sunlight since dawn. By afternoon, those surfaces can exceed 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The rock radiates heat upward through boot soles, and the dry air pulls moisture off skin so fast that rangers call it invisible sweating, where a hiker can lose over a quart of fluid per hour without ever feeling wet. What neither of them understood was that their bodies had been losing fluid at a dangerous rate since the moment they left the shade of the Mist Trail. By the time a person feels thirsty in extreme heat, the deficit is already significant, sometimes a full quart behind what the body needs to function safely. Dizziness, confusion, and impaired judgment follow, which means the worse the dehydration gets, the less capable you become of recognizing how bad it actually is. By noon, they had reached the top of Nevada Fall, roughly 3.5 miles in and about 2,000 feet up. The shade from the Mist Trail Canyon was behind them now, and the sun was directly overhead, reflecting off every exposed granite surface in every direction. They were already showing signs of strain. Tammy's face was deeply flushed and she was sweating heavily. Her breathing labored in a way that several passing hikers noticed. Gretchen appeared more composed, but was visibly struggling with the heat, her shirt soaked through. They rested at the top of Nevada Fall for roughly 30 minutes, during which Gretchen took several photos and posted one to her Instagram story. Tammy told Gretchen during the rest that she thought they should turn around. She said her feet were burning through her shoes, she was dizzy, and the distance remaining felt like more than she could handle. Gretchen told her the hardest part was already behind them and that the rest of the trail was mostly flat, which was not accurate. Tammy did not push further. They had consumed nearly all their water by this point. The 60-odd ounces they had carried between them was almost gone after 3.5 miles of steep terrain in extreme heat. The return trip would cover the same ground with the cable section and over 4 additional miles still ahead of them. Tammy mentioned being thirsty, and Gretchen told her they could fill up further along the trail. There are no reliable water sources between Nevada Fall and the summit that are safe to drink without filtration, which neither of them carried.
Honestly, the water thing alone, that should have been the end of the hike right there. Even if literally everything else went perfectly, they were already in a deficit that was only going to get worse in that kind of heat, and neither of them seemed to register that at all.
The section between Nevada Fall and the Subdome approach is roughly 3.5 miles of trail through thinning forest and across exposed granite slabs. It is less steep than the Mist Trail, but deceptively long and brutally exposed, with scattered tree cover that provides seconds of shade before opening back onto granite storing heat since dawn. Gretchen and Tammy moved through it slowly, stopping frequently. Tammy was limping slightly by 1 p.m. A hot spot on her right heel had turned into a blister she was trying to ignore.
Tammy's body had been telling her to stop since Nevada Fall. I genuinely think she knew this was the wrong way before the cables.
Gretchen's knees were visibly bothering her on downhill sections. The air temperature at this elevation was in the low 90°F, but on the exposed granite slabs where there was no shade for hundreds of yards at a time, the heat radiating off the rock surface added another 15 to 20 degrees to what their bodies were actually experiencing. Without adequate water, the cumulative effect of heat, exertion, and invisible fluid loss was shutting down their ability to cool themselves. Multiple hikers who were descending from the subdome that afternoon passed Gretchen and Tammy on the trail. At least 3 of these hikers later gave statements to park investigators. One couple from Colorado described stopping to talk to the 2 women sometime shortly after 1 p.m. and telling them directly that they needed to turn around because of the heat. The husband said the shorter woman, matching Tammy, was barely sweating despite the temperature and looked visibly unwell. Her skin flushed a deep red color that concerned him. He offered them water from his own supply. The taller woman, matching Gretchen's description, declined and said they were from Phoenix and knew how to handle heat. She said people exaggerated Half Dome all the time. The wife said the shorter woman looked like she wanted to accept the water but said nothing. A solo hiker from the Bay Area encountered them around 1:45 p.m. on the approach to the subdome and described a similar exchange. He told them the cables would be dangerous in this heat because the metal gets hot enough to burn bare hands and the exposed granite offers zero shade for the entire 400-foot climb. He said the taller woman told him she didn't need hiking advice from a stranger and kept walking. Every single person who talked to them on that trail tried to help, and every single one got either dismissed or flat out insulted. I keep coming back to that because the trail was basically full of people handing them the information that could have saved their lives, and they treated it like bad customer service reviews. The subdome approach is a steep scramble up granite slabs that have been baking in direct afternoon sun for hours, hot enough that hikers in previous summers reported burning their palms on the rock surface during the scramble. It takes most hikers 20 to 30 minutes. Gretchen and Tammy reached the base of the subdome at approximately 2:45 p.m. When Gretchen and Tammy reached the permit checkpoint, a wilderness ranger conducting permit enforcement that afternoon asked for their permits. Gretchen told him they had applied but didn't receive them and asked if they could go through anyway since they had come so far. The ranger told them no. Permits were required and the conditions were too dangerous. He pointed out that they appeared to have no water remaining and that the cable section in this heat with no hydration was life-threatening. He told them he had already turned back 6 groups that afternoon because of the heat advisory. Gretchen argued. She told the ranger they had been hiking all day and deserved to at least see the cables, asked to speak to someone else, asked if there was an exception process. The ranger maintained his position. He told them the cables were not safe in their current condition, that the steel was hot enough to cause burns, and that both of them showed visible signs of heat exhaustion.
I need to be careful here because the ranger genuinely did his job. He told them no, and what Gretchen did after that was entirely on her.
At approximately 3:05 p.m., the 2 women left the checkpoint area. The ranger assumed they were beginning their descent. Instead, they left the established route and crossed exposed granite terrain to reach the cable route, a scramble that was steep, unprotected, and hot enough to feel through their shoes. The ranger did not see them access the cables because he was engaged with another group.
This is the moment that gets me because up until now, you could argue they were just unprepared. After the bypass, they were making a choice.
Gretchen and Tammy reached the base of the cables at approximately 3:15 p.m. The cable route was completely deserted. The steel cables had been absorbing direct sunlight for nearly 10 hours, and the metal was radiating heat. A hiker resting in what little shade existed near the base later told investigators he had shouted to them that the cables would burn their hands without gloves. The reality was that the cables were empty because basically everyone who understood the mountain had already left. The heat had cleared the route more effectively than any ranger ever could. They began ascending. The cables require continuous pulling effort while stepping between wooden crossboards placed roughly every 10 feet on the granite slope. Under normal conditions, this is physically demanding. In a heat wave with the cable surface exceeding 140 degrees Fahrenheit, every grip becomes a burn. The granite under their feet was hot enough to feel through boot soles. The angle is steep enough that without the cables, the face would not be safely climbable without technical equipment. The drop on either side falls away across hundreds of feet of steep granite terrain. Experienced Half Dome hikers describe the cable section as the most exposed terrain they have ever been on, and most of them complete it under ideal conditions, with fresh legs, full hydration, and cool metal under their hands. Gretchen started up first, wrapping her hands around the cable and immediately pulling back. The steel was searing. She pulled her shirt sleeves over her palms and gripped through the fabric, pulling herself from crossboard to crossboard. The difference was that every trail she had ever attempted was something her body could actually do. Tammy followed roughly 10 feet behind, doing the same thing with her sleeves, but her shirt was thinner and the heat penetrated almost immediately.
I keep picturing that. Using your shirt as a glove on 140-degree steel, Honestly, that says everything about how far past rational thinking she already was.
Tammy's pace slowed dramatically within the first 50 feet. She was stopping at every crossboard, her breathing shallow and rapid, and her skin had shifted from sweating heavily to completely dry, flushed a deep, blotchy red and hot to the touch, which is one of the most dangerous signs of heat stroke progression. She had stopped sweating entirely. When your body stops producing sweat in extreme heat, it basically means the cooling system has completely failed, and that's the line between heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Once you cross it, things move very fast. She told Gretchen she felt dizzy and that the rock was spinning. Gretchen told her they were almost there. They were not almost there, not even close. They were still roughly 350 feet from the summit, with the steepest section still ahead. Tammy kept going because Gretchen told her to. The same dynamic that had basically governed their friendship for 18 months was now playing out on a 150-degree granite face with no shade, no water, and no way to cool down. At approximately 3:35 p.m., roughly 200 feet above the base of the cables, Tammy stopped moving. She was gripping the cable with both hands, but her body had gone rigid and her eyes were unfocused. Gretchen, roughly 15 feet above her, called down to her repeatedly. Tammy did not respond. Her legs began to buckle and she slumped sideways against the cable, her body weight catching between the cable and a crossboard. She was still technically upright, but only because the cable infrastructure was holding her there. Gretchen descended to Tammy's position. Tammy's skin was completely dry, burning hot to the touch, and had turned a deep, mottled red. Her breathing was rapid and erratic, and she was not responding to her name or to physical contact. These are basically the textbook signs of severe heat stroke, when the body's core temperature goes past 104 degrees and the brain starts shutting down systems to try to protect itself. The confusion, the loss of coordination, the dry burning skin, it's all the body saying it genuinely cannot cool itself anymore, and without intervention, the organs start failing within minutes. Gretchen tried to get Tammy to drink from what little water remained. Tammy could not swallow. Her muscles were cramping and jerking involuntarily against the cable.
I've sat with this part for a long time, and the thing that genuinely keeps me up is Gretchen had to make a choice on those cables. Stay with Tammy, who was dying in front of her, or leave her and try to go get help, and she chose to go.
Probably because she thought if she could just reach someone, Tammy would be okay. She genuinely thought there was still time, and I keep thinking about how she never saw Tammy conscious again after she let go of that cable. Gretchen spent roughly 10 minutes with Tammy before she began descending for help. She left Tammy propped between the cable and crossboard and began moving down the cables. Gretchen had been on the mountain for nearly 6 hours in extreme heat, with effectively no water for the last 4. Her hands were blistered from the hot cables. Her own body was in severe dehydration. She made it to the base of the cables and began the sub-dome scramble down. The granite slabs had been in direct sunlight all afternoon, hot enough to sear exposed skin on contact. Her coordination was failing, her vision narrowing, her steps uncertain on terrain that required precise foot placement. Approximately halfway down the sub-dome scramble, Gretchen lost her footing and collapsed on the exposed granite. A hiker, ascending from below, found her sprawled on the rock, unresponsive, with burns already forming on her exposed arms and the side of her face from the heated surface. He poured his remaining water over her head and neck and began shouting for help.
I honestly don't think Gretchen even understood she was dying. I think she genuinely believed she was going to get help and come back for Tammy, and that makes this so much worse for me.
Park rangers reached Gretchen on the sub-dome within 25 minutes. She was briefly conscious and told them she had left her friend on the cables, that she believed Tammy had passed out and needed a helicopter, and she lost consciousness shortly after. She was airlifted to a regional hospital. Her core body temperature at the time of evacuation was measured at 107.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Organ failure had already begun. Gretchen Landis did not survive transport. She was 49 years old. A rescue team reached Tammy on the cables approximately 40 minutes after Gretchen's collapse was reported. Tammy was unresponsive and had no detectable pulse. She was pronounced dead on the cable route. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be heat stroke based on the condition of her organs and the circumstances of exposure. Tammy Salcedo was 47 years old. No permits, no water, no gear, every warning dismissed. They bypassed the checkpoint and started the cables at 3:15 p.m. on metal baking for nearly 10 hours with nothing left to drink. The ranger at the Subdome had turned back 6 groups that afternoon. In 8 seasons, it was the first time a bypass ended in fatalities on his watch. That ranger is the one I honestly feel for the most, because he did everything right and the 2 people who ignored him are the ones who died, and he gets to live with that.
Both of them died on that mountain. Tammy on the cables, and Gretchen in a helicopter. And I genuinely believe that if either of them had been hiking alone, they would have turned around at Nevada Fall or at the Subdome.
Or maybe even at any of the dozen exits the trail gave them. But together they built this dynamic where the person making the decisions had no idea what she was doing, and the person who knew something was wrong couldn't say it loud enough, and in extreme heat with no water. That is what killed them both. Gretchen's last post was from Nevada Fall. Shortly after noon, 340 likes, a caption about conquering fears. The account is still public. Tammy was 47. She didn't want to be on Half Dome. She was there because her friend told her she could do it, and she believed her friend more than her own body. Gretchen was 49. She believed it too. The mountain didn't kill them. The heat didn't kill them. The same voice that had been telling Tammy to keep going for 18 months told her to keep going one more time, and this time there was nowhere left to go. It was the 11th of May, 2026. The Upper Yosemite Falls Trail was fully exposed to late spring heat, with temperatures exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit and long, unshaded stretches across steep terrain of packed dirt, loose rock, and eroded granite steps. Heat built steadily across the exposed sections, with minimal cover available as the trail climbed through open rock faces and sun-baked switchbacks. Pines Beldad, age 34, an IT consultant from Las Vegas, Nevada, had experience with desert hiking and heat exposure, but limited familiarity with sustained elevation gain in mountainous terrain. Confident in his conditioning, he carried a reduced water supply, prioritizing pace over extended hydration planning. He began the ascent early, moving steadily through the cooler morning hours with a consistent rhythm as the trail steepened. In the lower sections, he passed hikers who paused frequently, while he continued upward with minimal stops. As elevation increased, direct sun exposure intensified and reflective granite amplified heat across exposed stretches. Water use increased steadily throughout the climb. Long, unshaded sections, limited recovery time, and exertion accumulated gradually rather than in clear breaks. By the time he reached higher elevations, his remaining water supply was significantly reduced.
I've seen that pattern before. Strong start, then the water situation catches up quietly in the background. It never feels urgent until suddenly it is.
At several upper viewpoints, he paused for extended rest and photography. These stops were longer than earlier breaks and pushed his descent into the hottest part of the day when temperature and trail exposure peaked. As he began the descent, conditions had clearly worsened. The already uneven trail became more demanding under fatigue, with slower downhill movement on loose stone and irregular granite steps. Observers later noted increased caution, longer pauses, and occasional reliance on more stable inner trail edges where footing was firmer. Dehydration and heat exposure began to compound. His movement became less consistent, with minor hesitations before stepping down uneven sections and occasional stumbles that required brief recovery before continuing. While he remained on the maintained trail, his stability appeared reduced compared to the earlier climb.
Downhill in that condition isn't really easier. It just exposes everything that's been building up on the way up.
As he descended further, he entered a narrower section of trail, bordered by loose rock on one side and a steep drop into a drainage channel on the other. The path here was constrained, forcing hikers into single-file movement with limited space to pass. Several hikers were moving more slowly ahead, creating intermittent pauses along the descent line. He stepped slightly aside to allow others to pass. The ground at the edge of the trail consisted of loose, fragmented rock and thin soil over hard granite. Under load, the material lacked cohesion. As his foot shifted onto this outer edge, the surface began to give way almost immediately. The loss of support was sudden. His foot slipped laterally as the edge collapsed, and his body shifted off balance toward the downhill side of the slope. He attempted to correct his position, but the combination of fatigue, steep angle, and unstable footing prevented recovery. He fell off the maintained trail and transitioned into a sliding descent down a steep, rocky drainage slope below the path. The initial slide accelerated quickly as loose soil and rock fragments broke away beneath him, removing any remaining resistance. His trajectory carried him diagonally across the slope, with increasing speed as the terrain steepened. During the descent, he struck multiple fixed objects, including embedded rocks and exposed outcrops, each impact altering his direction but not stopping the fall. The slope funneled him toward a drainage channel, where larger boulders and irregular rock formations created a more confined path.
Once someone drops into a drainage like that, the terrain takes over completely. There's no real control left at that point.
He entered the channel at speed, continuing to collide with uneven rock surfaces. The terrain in this section was composed of large, fixed boulders and debris from previous erosion events, which contributed to repeated high-force impacts. The motion only ceased after he reached a lower section of the drainage area, below the main trail, and out of sight from hikers above. Other hikers reported hearing or observing movement off-trail and alerted park personnel. Some witnesses initially mistook the sound of impacts for falling debris until they observed movement below the trail line and recognized a human fall. Rangers were notified shortly afterward and initiated a response, but access was delayed due to steep terrain and the need to approach from a lower access route. Recovery teams reached the location later that day after coordinating access through the drainage system and adjacent slopes. Pines was located in a lower rocky section of the channel, separated from the main trail corridor. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from multiple blunt force injuries sustained during a high-energy fall with repeated impacts along a steep drainage slope. Investigators concluded that dehydration, fatigue, and loss of footing on unstable trail edge material directly contributed to the incident, compounded by the steep terrain and loose surface conditions of the descent path. On July 14, 2015, the South Kaibab Trail in Arizona's Grand Canyon looked like the perfect summer hike. 7 miles of stunning views from rim to river. But with nearly 4,800 feet of exposed descent and no shade, it's also one of the most dangerous trails in the country. And the hikers who get into the most trouble are rarely the ones who seem unprepared. Lynette Caulfield was 51 years old and lived in Scottsdale, Arizona. She worked in residential real estate, had built a comfortable life around her ability to read situations and make decisions quickly, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from spending most of your adult life being right. She was organized, she was capable, and she had quietly extended both of those qualities into areas where they didn't actually apply. Her experience outdoors was real, but it was narrow. A guided hike in Sedona, a resort trail in Costa Rica, and a half-day canyon tour in New Mexico where a guide handled the route and the company handled everything else. Each of those trips had gone fine, and she had filed them away as evidence that she knew what she was doing outside.
It's an easy mistake to make. The feeling of experience and actual experience aren't always the same thing.
Renee Sorrento was 46, also from Scottsdale, and had been close with Lynette for nearly a decade after they met through a neighborhood social group. She ran half marathons on weekends, tracked her mileage carefully, and had built a strong part of her identity around being physically fit. That fitness had become something she referenced, consciously or not, whenever anyone implied she might not be capable of something. She had a tendency to trust her own judgment over cautionary advice, especially when that advice felt overly restrictive.
Combined with Lynette's similar outlook, it created a friendship where skepticism was often reserved for everyone except each other, and that dynamic was going to matter a great deal on this particular day.
The trip had been Lynette's idea from the beginning. She had come across photos of the South Kaibab Trail on a travel account she followed the wide ridgeline, the canyon walls dropping away in layers of red and orange on both sides, the Colorado River, visible as a thin green ribbon thousands of feet below, and almost immediately decided she wanted to see it for herself. Over the next few evenings, she read trail reviews, checked distances, and looked over maps. The picture that emerged seemed straightforward enough. A difficult hike, certainly, but not an unreasonable one for two active women who considered themselves experienced outdoors. The reviews weren't entirely reassuring. Many mentioned the heat, the need to start early, and the fact that South Kaibab had no reliable water sources along the trail. But those warnings didn't appear to change her mind. Like many hikers reading about a trail they've already fallen in love with, Lynette seems to have focused more on how to make the hike work than on reasons not to attempt it. When she brought the idea to Renee, the reaction was much the same. Renee looked at the photos, checked the mileage, and agreed that it seemed manageable. They settled on a trip in mid-July without giving much weight to the timing. Lynette had spent most of her life in Arizona and was accustomed to desert summers.
And whether consciously or not, that familiarity may have made the canyon's July heat feel less intimidating than it actually was.
They drove up from Scottsdale the day before, arriving at the South Rim in the late afternoon. The temperature at the rim was in the low 90s. Warm but not alarming, the kind of heat that felt familiar and manageable to two women who had spent their lives in the Arizona desert. The canyon itself was something else entirely. Photos had given them a sense of the scale, but standing at the rim and actually looking down at it was different. The layers of rock descending for what felt like forever, The river so far below it looked almost still, the trail switchbacking down the ridgeline in a way that made the whole thing look both enormous, from up here, entirely doable. They spent the evening walking along the rim, taking photos, and looking down at the route they planned to hike the following morning. The inner canyon was already in shadow by the time they arrived, which made it look cooler and more inviting than it actually was.
I've stood on that rim before, and let me tell you, it's genuinely hard not to be fooled by it. The canyon hides what it is until you're actually already inside it.
The forecast for the following day showed clear skies and a high of 94 degrees Fahrenheit at the rim. Lynette probably considered that reasonable for July in Arizona, packed 2 water bottles per person, roughly 80 ounces total between them, set an alarm for 7 a.m., and went to sleep. What she didn't look for, and may not have known to look for, was the inner canyon temperature projection sitting in a separate line of that same forecast. It read 114 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. The rim and the canyon floor are 2 completely different climates separated by less than 10 miles of trail, and the forecast treats them as such. They arrived at the South Kaibab trailhead at 8:20 a.m., later than Lynette had originally planned. Getting ready had taken longer than expected, and the trailhead was only accessible by park shuttle from the main visitor area, which meant they had to wait for a bus that ran on its own schedule regardless of how early they had wanted to start. Lynette made a comment about the shuttle system being poorly managed while they waited. Renee agreed and said the whole operation felt disorganized for a place that charged what it charged to get in. The trailhead itself was busy. July brought enormous crowds to the Grand Canyon, and even at that hour, there were hikers adjusting packs, checking maps, and taking photos at the rim before heading down. Warning signs were posted prominently near the trail entrance large, clearly worded, "Impossible to miss." They said that summer hiking on South Kaibab was dangerous, that the trail had no water sources at any point along the route, that temperatures in the inner canyon regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and that hikers were strongly advised not to attempt the full descent between May and September without significant preparation and experience. One sign specifically recommended turning around at Cedar Ridge, roughly 1.5 miles down during summer months, and described the return climb in afternoon heat as the primary cause of heat-related emergencies on the trail. Lynette glanced over the signs and said they were obviously written for people who'd never hiked before. Renee said the park probably put them up to avoid getting sued.
Reading this now, it's hard not to notice the irony. In a few hours, they would learn exactly why those signs were there.
A ranger was stationed at the trailhead that morning. He had been there since before sunrise, speaking with every group that came through, and the morning had already been long July at the Grand Canyon meant a constant stream of visitors, many of them with plans that needed to be adjusted before they started down. He had redirected several groups to shorter routes already that morning, and a few had turned around entirely after speaking with him. He was calm and direct and had given this particular conversation enough times to know exactly what he needed to say and how much time he had to say it before people stopped listening. When Lynette and Renee approached the trail entrance, he greeted them and asked about their plan for the day. Lynette told him they were hiking down to the river and back. He asked how much water they were carrying. She told him 2 bottles each, about 80 ounces total between them. He told her that for a full descent and return on South Kaibab in July, that amount was significantly below what the conditions required. The general guidance for summer inner canyon hiking was a minimum of 1 liter per person per hour, and a full round trip to the river and back was a full day of hiking in temperatures that would exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. Lynette told him they were from Arizona and knew how to handle heat. He didn't argue with that. He said inner canyon heat in July was a different category from surface desert heat. The canyon walls trapped and radiated everything the sun had put into them since sunrise. There was no shade anywhere on the South Kaibab, and the return climb was where people got into serious trouble because by the time they started back up, they were already depleted from the descent and the heat had been building for hours. He told her he had personally responded to medical emergencies involving fit, experienced people on this trail in July, and that fitness didn't change what 113 degrees Fahrenheit did to a body that had run out of water. She told him she appreciated the information and stepped toward the trail. He moved slightly, not blocking her, and told her specifically that the NPS recommendation was not to hike below Cedar Ridge between May and September, and that he was asking them to consider turning around at that point and saving the full descent for a cooler time of year.
Cedar Ridge was still a worthwhile hike. The views were spectacular, and they would be back at the rim well before the heat became dangerous. In fact, a lot of people turn around and never feel like they missed a thing.
Renee said Cedar Ridge was barely a mile down, and they hadn't driven 3 hours to walk a mile and turn around. Lynette said she had hiked in conditions like this before and was perfectly capable of assessing her own limits without assistance. The ranger said he wasn't questioning their fitness, he was telling them that extreme heat was a physical condition that affected everyone regardless of fitness level, and that the trail had no water and no shade for the entire descent, which meant
I don't know what else he could have done. He wasn't trying to ruin their hike, he was trying to keep them from having the kind of day that people end up writing reports about later.
Lynette looked at him for a moment. Then she told him that if the trail was genuinely too dangerous to hike, it should be closed, and since it wasn't, she would appreciate it if he stepped aside. And then she told him she found it remarkable that a national park employed people specifically to stand at trailheads and discourage visitors from using the trails they had paid to access. The ranger said nothing further. He noted their description and start time in his log and watched them begin the descent. The first section of the South Kaibab is immediately and genuinely spectacular, and that's part of what makes it dangerous. The trail drops along an open ridgeline from the moment you leave the trailhead, and within the first quarter mile, the canyon is falling away on both sides of you in a way that makes it almost impossible to focus on anything except the view. Layer after layer of red and orange and pale cream-colored rock descends toward the river far below, and the scale of it is the kind of thing that takes a few minutes to actually process. Most people stop constantly in the first mile just to look around, and Lynette and Renee were no different. The morning air at the rim was still in the mid-80s when they started, which felt warm but entirely manageable. The trail was busy with other hikers. The atmosphere was energetic, and the physical effort of the descent was easy, in the way that going downhill always is when your legs are fresh and the grade is gentle. Lynette took photos frequently and said the ranger had been completely unnecessary and that the trail was exactly what she had expected. Renee said she felt great and that the views were even better in person than they had looked online. They passed Cedar Ridge, the specific point the ranger had named, without stopping or discussing it. Lynette noted it and kept walking. Renee said turning around there would have been a waste of the entire trip. They kept moving down. As they dropped below the rim, the temperature began climbing in a way that was gradual enough to feel normal. It just felt like the sun was getting stronger as the morning went on, which seemed entirely reasonable for July in Arizona. What was actually happening was that they were descending into a different climate, one where the canyon walls on either side had been absorbing heat since sunrise and were now radiating it back from every surface, where the air had no moisture to carry heat away, and where the temperature was rising roughly 2 to 3 degrees for every 1,000 feet of elevation they lost. They couldn't feel that math happening. They just felt warm, which felt fine. They passed a couple coming back up, about 2 miles down, both of them flushed and moving slowly, not talking, focused entirely on the trail in front of them. Lynette said they looked like they'd started too late in the day. Renee said some people just didn't pace themselves properly.
What neither of them seemed to consider was that those two people coming back up, exhausted, flushed, not talking, were a preview. That was going to be them in a few hours, except by then, it would be much worse.
Water consumption had started without either of them tracking it carefully. The heat made drinking feel automatic. A sip here, a sip there, whenever the mouth felt dry, and neither of them was counting how much was left or calculating how far they still had to go. By the time they reached the Tonto platform, roughly 4.5 miles down and about 3,200 feet below the rim, the morning had given way to full midday heat, and the trail had become something noticeably different from what it had been at the top. The temperature at that elevation was well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and still climbing. The inner canyon amplified everything. The rock on either side of the trail radiated heat that had been building since before they arrived, the air was dry enough that sweat evaporated almost the moment it formed, and the pale sandstone beneath their feet reflected heat upward from below as well as down from above. There was no direction that wasn't hot. The descent had felt easy, and that was the problem. Going down 3,200 feet of elevation in extreme heat depletes the body in ways that don't announce themselves clearly while you're moving. The legs are working constantly to control the descent, the cardiovascular system is running harder than it feels like it is, and the fluid loss from sweating in that kind of heat is faster than the thirst signal can keep up with. Both women had been losing water faster than they were replacing it for hours, and neither of them knew it because the dry air had been evaporating their sweat before they could feel how much they were producing. Lynette had become quieter over the last mile. The commentary about the views and the other hikers had stopped, replaced by a focus on the trail immediately ahead. She checked her water bottle during a rest stop and didn't say anything about what she saw. Renee said her legs felt heavier than she had expected. Lynette told her it was the elevation change and that they'd feel better once they turned around and got moving again. They rested briefly at the Tonto platform. The Colorado River was visible below, closer than it had been from the rim, but still a significant distance down. Lynette looked at it for a moment. By then, reaching the river had become more than just a hiking objective. It was the plan she had defended to Renee, to the ranger, and to herself. She didn't say anything about changing course, and Renee didn't suggest it. They kept descending. They reached the river corridor at approximately 11:50 a.m. The temperature at the bottom was 113 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no shade anywhere near the trail. The Colorado River was right there, wide and green and moving, but the water wasn't safe to drink without treatment equipment. Neither of them had brought, and standing next to it in 113 degrees Fahrenheit heat with no shade provided almost no relief at all. They stopped for about 10 minutes. Lynette sat down on a rock and didn't get up quickly. Renee finished the last of her water and held the empty bottle for a moment without saying anything about it. They had roughly 7 miles of trail ahead of them to get back to the rim.
Think about that for a second. They were sitting at the bottom of the Grand Canyon in the middle of July with empty water bottles and a 7-mile climb back to the top.
The ranger had told them exactly how much water they needed. He had told them exactly what the heat would be. He had told them exactly what the return climb would cost them. And they were sitting at the bottom with nothing left, about to find out that every single thing he said was true. After a few minutes, Lynette got to her feet and said they needed to start back. Something in her voice had changed. Renee seemed to notice it too. Without saying much else, they started up the trail. The first 20 minutes of the return climb were manageable in the way that the beginning of something always is. They were moving, they had a direction, and the immediate physical effort of climbing gave them something to focus on besides the heat. But the return on South Kaibab in July is a fundamentally different experience from the descent, and the difference becomes clear very quickly. Going up generates body heat through exertion, on top of the ambient temperature that's already there. The canyon walls on either side of the trail had been absorbing heat since before sunrise, and were now radiating it back at full intensity. The trail surface itself was hot enough to feel through the soles of their shoes. There was no breeze, no cloud cover, no shade at any point on the route, and no water anywhere on the trail for the entire 7 miles back to the rim. The body's ability to cool itself through sweating depends entirely on having enough fluid to produce sweat, and both women had run out of fluid at the bottom. Their cooling systems were running on empty in the hottest part of the day on the most exposed trail in the canyon. Within 30 minutes of starting back up, both women were in trouble they weren't fully recognizing yet. Lynette's pace had dropped significantly. She was stopping every few hundred feet rather than every half mile, and the stops were lasting longer each time. Her face was deeply flushed, and when Renee looked at her during one of those stops, she noticed that Lynette wasn't sweating anymore, which in 113 degrees Fahrenheit heat meant something specific and serious was happening. The body stops sweating when it no longer has the fluid to produce it, and when sweating stops in extreme heat, core temperature rises without any mechanism to slow it down.
That transition from heat exhaustion to heat stroke is the point of no return without immediate intervention. The cruel part is that people experiencing it often don't even realize what's happening.
Lynette said she felt dizzy during one of the stops and sat down on the trail. She said she just needed a minute. Renee sat down next to her and waited. Renee was dealing with her own version of the same problem. She was still on her feet, but her thinking had become slow and unreliable in a way she wasn't fully aware of. She kept asking Lynette questions about how far they had come and how far they still had to go, questions she should have been able to answer herself, and when Lynette's responses became slow and didn't quite track, Renee didn't immediately register that as an emergency. Her own cognition was compromised enough that she was processing what she was seeing more slowly than she normally would have. The conclusion she reached, that Lynette needed a few minutes to rest and would be okay, was the wrong one, but it was the only one she had the capacity to reach at that point. Other hikers passed them on the trail. A few slowed down and asked if they were okay. Lynette waved them on and said they were fine. Renee didn't respond to one group at all, which the hikers noticed and remembered later. The window for an early emergency call was passing with every group that moved on. Approximately 2.1 miles into the return climb, Lynette stopped walking and did not start again. She sat down on the trail, said she needed a minute, and then became very difficult to communicate with. Her responses to Renee's questions were slow and disconnected. She answered questions that hadn't been asked and didn't answer the ones that had. She was no longer sweating. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch. She was not oriented to where she was or what was happening around her.
In cases like this, confusion isn't just a symptom, it's evidence that the heat is beginning to overwhelm the body's ability to protect itself.
Renee sat with her. She did not call for help. She waited for Lynette to recover, which was the wrong response, but Renee's own body temperature was elevated. Her fluid deficit was severe, and her ability to think clearly and act decisively had been eroding for the last hour without her realizing it. She was sitting in 111 degrees Fahrenheit heat with no water next to someone who was in the process of dying, and she didn't have the cognitive capacity left to fully understand what she was looking at. A group of hikers coming down the trail found them approximately 15 minutes later. Lynette was unresponsive. Renee was conscious but confused and couldn't give clear answers about how long they had been sitting or how much water they had consumed. One member of the group had a satellite communicator and sent an emergency alert immediately. Others in the group had water and began giving it to Renee and attempting to get some into Lynette, but Lynette was unresponsive and could not drink. They used wet clothing to try to cool her skin. The temperature on the trail at that point was 111 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was no shade within reach. The emergency alert was received, and a response was initiated, but reaching the two women was not straightforward. Their location, approximately 2.5 miles above the river and 2.4 miles below the rim, was accessible only on foot or by helicopter, and summer heat in the inner canyon creates air density conditions that limit what a helicopter can carry and when it can safely operate. A ground response team was deployed from the rim, while an air assessment was conducted simultaneously. The hikers who found them stayed on scene and kept doing what they could. Here's just the revised ending. The ground response team reached them approximately 55 minutes after the alert was sent. By that point, Lynette had been unresponsive for over an hour in direct sun with no cooling and no hydration, and her core temperature when the team reached her was recorded at 108 degrees Fahrenheit.
At that temperature, organ damage is not a possibility, it's a certainty. The question is only how much has already occurred and whether any of it can be reversed.
Renee was still conscious when the team arrived, but just barely. She had been sitting in the same heat, with the same empty bottles, next to someone she couldn't help, for nearly an hour. Her body had been running on nothing for a long time by then. Lynette Caulfield was evacuated by helicopter after the ground team stabilized her enough for transport. She did not regain consciousness. She was pronounced dead that evening. Renee Sorrento was evacuated shortly after by the ground team. She was unresponsive by the time she was loaded for transport and did not recover. She was pronounced dead the following morning. The coroner determined that both Lynette Caulfield and Renee Sorrento died from exertional heat stroke. Contributing factors for both included severe dehydration, prolonged exposure to extreme ambient temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit, physical exertion during the return ascent, and the complete absence of any cooling mechanism or hydration during the critical period following the onset of symptoms. Lynette's core temperature at the time of evacuation was recorded at 108 degrees Fahrenheit. Renee's was 106 degrees Fahrenheit. The cases were ruled accidental. Evidence recovered included Lynette's phone, which contained time-stamped photos placing both women at the river corridor at 11:47 a.m. and on the return trail at 12:09 p.m. GPS data from Renee's fitness tracker confirmed their pace, their route, and the exact point at which movement stopped. The trailhead entry log contained both names with a recorded start time of 8:34 a.m. The ranger's log noted the time of their interaction and his description of the water they were carrying, which was consistent with what the responding team found at the scene, 2 empty bottles between them, both dry.
It was the 25th of April, 2026. The Half Dome cable route was open under a spring weather window after winter conditions had receded. The morning was mild, but stronger upper-level winds signaled changing conditions across the exposed granite dome. Melvin Dimple, age 31, a sales manager from Phoenix, Arizona, had planned the Half Dome climb as the defining goal of his trip. He had experience with long desert hikes and endurance-based outdoor activity, but limited exposure to steep alpine routes reliant on fixed steel cables and narrow wooden boards on near-vertical granite. The permit was secured months in advance, and he treated the ascent as a personal benchmark he intended to complete regardless of conditions. People often arrive with a finish it no matter what mindset, but Half Dome doesn't respond to determination or intent. I've seen that attitude run into problems up there more than once. He started early and moved steadily through forested trail sections and granite approach slopes without difficulty as the terrain shifted from defined path to exposed rock and then into the steep chute leading toward the cable section. By the time he reached the base, congestion had already formed, with hikers stacked in uneven intervals as groups paused before entering the steepest part of the route. The cable section slowed immediately. Wooden planks dictated footing, But hikers ahead frequently paused mid-climb, forcing those below to hold position on steep granite while gripping the cables. As Melvin moved into the midsection, spacing tightened further as hesitation at board transitions created delays that rippled down the line. The granite beneath the route, worn smooth by heavy use, offered limited traction when unweighted, increasing strain during each pause. By late morning, cloud cover thickened across surrounding ridges, shifting light across the dome in alternating bands of brightness and shadow, while wind moved intermittently across the exposed face. Despite the changing conditions, movement remained compressed into short, uneven bursts as progress continued. Melvin maintained controlled descent, alternating between gripping the cable and stepping carefully between boards. However, the structure of the route required repeated transitions, where full footing briefly replaced cable support. These moments became more critical as congestion forced longer pauses, leaving hikers standing on steep granite without forward motion for extended periods.
There's a fatigue that builds up quietly on that climb, not from distance, but from never really getting to relax your grip.
By early afternoon, light precipitation began to fall. It started as fine droplets that spread quickly across the exposed rock surface. The granite, already polished by heavy use, changed character as moisture reduced friction. Wet patches formed unevenly, particularly on sloped sections between wooden boards where runoff collected in thin films.
The thing about the cable section is that it stops being a trail and starts being a queue on a slope. People don't really think of it that way until everything slows down.
Witnesses later described a sudden loss of stability rather than a clear, directional slip. His feet gave way almost simultaneously, and his body dropped relative to the cable line. He tried to recover by pulling against the steel support, managing only a brief moment of resistance as his lower body swung outward along the steep slope. The combination of wet granite and sharp incline quickly overwhelmed his grip. His hands detached from the cable shortly after, removing his only remaining point of support. Once separated, his descent became fully uncontrolled. He entered a sliding fall along exposed granite beside the cable route, accelerating as the slope steepened. The motion was uneven and repeatedly disrupted by rock outcrops that altered his trajectory and increased the severity of impacts. The slide continued across multiple granite sections before gradually transitioning toward a lower area where the incline began to reduce. Hikers above and below attempted to alert others and move toward the incident site, but congestion along the cable route prevented immediate coordinated response. Many remained fixed in place due to lack of passing space, while others hesitated to enter the wet upper section where footing had become unreliable. Emergency services were notified quickly, but access was delayed by both weather and the technical difficulty of the route. Rangers and rescue personnel waited for conditions to improve before ascending the cables and adjacent rock routes to reach the fall zone. Melvin was pronounced dead at the scene due to multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a high-energy fall and repeated impacts along a steep granite surface. The investigation concluded that wet granite conditions, congestion along the cable route, and loss of traction during a transition between fixed board sections were primary contributing factors. No evidence of equipment failure or medical emergency was identified. The 17th of July, 2018, South Kaibab Trail, Grand Canyon National Park, Arizona, 5:47 in the morning. The parking lot at the trailhead was already packed. It was a Tuesday, but it didn't matter. The Grand Canyon draws 4 to 5 million visitors a year, and in mid-July, early morning was the only time the air felt remotely tolerable. Families were taking photos against the railing. A dad was yelling at his kids to stop leaning over the edge. A couple was sharing a granola bar and looking out at a view so big it almost doesn't process right in your brain. A park ranger made his rounds along the rim, stopping every few minutes to speak to groups gathering near the trailhead. His delivery was practiced, but not robotic.
You could tell he'd said it 1,000 times and still meant every single one.
He told people the canyon was unforgiving in summer heat. He told them dehydration and heat stroke could set in faster than they expected. He told them the trail down to the Colorado River was nearly 7 miles one way and dropped almost 5,000 feet in elevation.
Then he said the line that I've heard rangers say at this canyon more times than any other.
Going down is optional, coming back up is mandatory. Most people nodded politely and kept moving. A few took photos of the warning signs near the trailhead, the ones with bold red text about summer fatalities, not because the signs alarmed them, but because they thought it was funny, a morbid little souvenir. Somewhere in that crowd was a 21-year-old from Texas named Brandon Kowalski. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of build that made strangers assume he played college sports because he did. He was a starting linebacker. He laughed when he heard the Rangers' warning. To Brandon, the canyon looked manageable. The first section of trail from the rim was visible, and the switchbacks didn't look that steep. The morning was still cool. His body was a machine he had been maintaining and testing for years. He had no reason to believe any of this applied to him.
Now, I think that to understand what happened on that trail, you have to understand who Brandon was.
Brandon was a standout college football player from Texas who built his identity around his athleticism and discipline. Years of praise from coaches, teammates, and others convinced him that he was physically exceptional and could handle challenges that stopped ordinary people. However, his experience was limited to sports training and controlled environments, leaving him unaware that football conditioning does not prepare someone for the dangers of extreme desert hiking. He planned a pre-senior year road trip with his roommate Jabari Warren and Jabari's cautious girlfriend Lucy Miura. They had already been through Las Vegas and stopped at Hoover Dam, which Brandon had found underwhelming.
That should have registered in hindsight prior to that Tuesday's hike, but he wasn't thinking.
The Grand Canyon was on the itinerary as a half-day stop, take some photos from the rim, maybe walk partway down one of the trails, then drive on to their next destination. That plan lasted until Brandon saw hikers coming back up the trail with dust on their boots and empty water bottles in hand. Someone near them mentioned, almost casually, that if you kept going down far enough, you'd reach the Colorado River itself.
Believe me or not, that was all it took.
Brandon immediately decided to hike to the Colorado River after hearing how difficult it was, viewing it as a challenge to prove his toughness rather than a carefully planned goal. Jabari and Lucy recognized this familiar pattern of overconfidence. The South Kaibab Trail is one of the Grand Canyon's most demanding routes. With nearly 14 miles round trip, about 4,780 feet of elevation change, no water sources, and little shade. Summer temperatures can exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit at the canyon floor, far hotter than conditions at the rim. Despite prominent warnings at the trailhead explaining heat stroke, heat-related deaths, and advising against a rim-to-river and back hike in summer, Brandon dismissed the risks.
Below that was a line that I keep coming back to.
It noted that athletes and physically fit individuals were particularly vulnerable because their confidence often led them to push past early warning signs that their bodies were sending. Brandon took a photo beside that sign. Based on what Jabari and Lucy told investigators afterward, he made a comment to the effect that whoever wrote it wasn't thinking about someone like him. A ranger who overheard the exchange stopped and spoke to the group. He didn't lecture. He just asked where they were planning to go, and, when Brandon said the river, laid out the problem plainly. The canyon floor would be over 110 degrees by mid-morning. They were starting too late in the day for a safe round trip, and the water they were carrying, a few standard bottles each, was nowhere near enough for 14 miles of desert hiking in July heat. Brandon thanked him politely, but the look on his face, according to Lucy, was not gratitude. It was the look he got when someone told him he couldn't do something. She said later that she recognized it immediately and felt her stomach drop. Lucy told him she thought the ranger was right. She said the trail looked really long from the rim and she wasn't sure she was up for it. Jabari agreed and said they should at least think about it. Brandon told them they were overthinking it. He said the ranger was just doing his job and giving the standard speech. He said they'd be fine. Each warning he received that morning had the same effect. It made him more certain he was going. By the time they actually stepped onto the trail, his decision had nothing to do with wanting to see the river anymore.
I think it's plausible that it had become about proving something to Lucy, to Jabari, and most of all, to himself.
They started down the South Kaibab shortly after sunrise, somewhere around 6:15 in the morning. The first thing that hits you on this trail is the color. The canyon walls are layered in bands of red and orange and cream and deep rust, and in early morning light, they almost look like they're lit from inside. The air was still cool enough that Brandon would have felt good, loose, energized, the kind of feeling that comes before the body starts its real work. The South Kaibab drops fast. It doesn't ease you in. Within the first half mile, the switchbacks begin cutting back and forth across the canyon face, and the trail drops sharply enough that you feel it in your quads almost immediately on the way down. Most hikers pace themselves here instinctively. Brandon did not. Jabari said later that Brandon was out in front within minutes. Not jogging, but walking with the kind of deliberate pace that made it obvious he was measuring himself against everyone else on the trail. And there was plenty of competition to measure against. On a busy summer morning on the South Kaibab, the trail is genuinely crowded. Day hikers carrying camera bags, families with kids and hydration packs, Trail runners moving in both directions. Backpackers with permits and 60-pound loads headed down to camp. The park also runs mule trains along this trail, and you hear them before you see them, the soft thudding of hooves on packed dirt and the occasional snort echoing off the rock. Brandon passed all of them. Older hikers, younger hikers, people in better gear, people with trekking poles. He moved past every one of them, and according to Lucy, each pass seemed to add something to his mood, a kind of visible satisfaction.
I think it was probably like he was collecting data that confirmed what he already believed.
The views kept opening up the further down they went. Looking up, the rim gets smaller and more distant. Looking out, you can see layer after layer of canyon wall stretching in every direction, and the scale of it does something to your sense of time. You start to feel very small and very old simultaneously, which is either humbling or uncomfortable depending on who you are. By the time they reached Cedar Ridge, which sits roughly 1.5 miles down the trail, Lucy had slowed considerably. She was already warm, and she was the only one who had been drinking water consistently. She said her feet were starting to ache from the downhill grade. Jabari was sweating heavily and had gone quieter than usual. Brandon had barely broken a sweat, and he made a point of mentioning it. He interpreted what he was seeing in Jabari and Lucy as evidence that the warnings from the morning had been exaggerated, aimed at people like his friends, not people like him. A group of hikers coming upward past them near Cedar Ridge, and their faces showed the kind of exhaustion that goes past tired into something more serious. Brandon watched them and, by Lucy's account, made a comment under his breath about how some people just weren't in shape for this.
He wasn't being cruel, he genuinely believed it, and I think that was the biggest problem of them all.
They kept going. The trail continued downward past Skeleton Point, which sits at about 5,160 feet and offers the first clear view of the Colorado River far below. Most day hikers turn around here. The recommendation from the Park Service is firm about this Skeleton Point is the turnaround for summer day hikers, no exceptions. A sign says so in plain language. Brandon looked at the river, looked at the sign, and kept walking. They reached the river at the bottom of the canyon sometime around 10 inches the morning. The temperature at the canyon floor by that point was somewhere in the neighborhood of 110 degrees Fahrenheit, possibly higher in the direct sun along the exposed rock near the water. The Colorado River itself runs cold, fed by snowmelt, and released from deep in Lake Powell, and the contrast with the ambient air is shocking when you first get close to it. The water looked green and fast, and the canyon walls rose up on both sides so steeply it felt like standing at the bottom of a crack in the earth. Brandon felt fine. He was sweating, but he said that his energy felt intact.
I'm not sure if that was true, but he took that as confirmation for himself.
What he likely didn't know, and what matters enormously here, is that heat illness doesn't always announce itself immediately. The body can maintain relatively normal function for a period, while heat stress accumulates underneath. Feeling okay at the bottom of the canyon after a 4.5-hour descent in July heat doesn't mean your body is handling the situation well. It may mean the damage is building quietly, below the level of perception. They rested near the river. Other hikers were there too, experienced backpackers with permits who had camped overnight and were preparing to head back out. Several of them, noticing that the three of them had nothing but basic water supplies and no overnight gear, told them directly to head back up immediately. One backpacker, based on what Jabari later told rangers, was emphatic. He said something to the effect that the canyon doesn't care how strong you are, it runs on its own terms. And those terms include physics and chemistry that no amount of fitness can override. Brandon didn't argue. He just smiled and took photos. He shot video of the river. He took photos of himself standing at the bank, grinning, squinting against the light. Based on what investigators later recovered from his phone, he had drafted messages to teammates back in Texas describing the hike as not that hard, saying the warnings had been overblown. There was no cell service at the canyon floor, so the messages sat unsent in his outbox. He never got to a place where he could send them. The three of them should have turned around the moment they arrived. Every piece of guidance from the Park Service printed, posted, and spoken aloud by rangers that morning said as much. Instead, they rested for somewhere close to an hour. Lucy said later that she tried twice to get Brandon moving, and both times he told her there was no rush. That hour mattered. In the heat of a July canyon floor, an extra hour of sun exposure and elevated body temperature is not a minor thing. The physics of heat illness are cumulative. Every additional minute spent at the bottom in that heat was a minute the body spent depleting its ability to regulate itself on the way back up. By the time they started the ascent, it was approaching noon.
I've never been to that area of the Grand Canyon, but I'm relatively familiar with it.
The first thing you notice when you start climbing out is that nothing about it resembles the way down. Going down, your legs are doing work, but it's breaking work, eccentric contractions, the kind that leave your quads sore 2 days later but don't necessarily feel brutal in the moment. Going up is a completely different demand. It is continuous, grinding, forward-leaning effort against gravity, sustained over thousands of feet of elevation gain in heat that intensifies the further you get from the river without the canyon walls offering shade. Lucy felt it almost immediately. Within the first mile of the climb, she told Jabari and Brandon that she wasn't confident she could make it to the rim. Not because she lacked effort she was pushing, but because her body was sending signals that felt different from ordinary fatigue. She was dizzy, her heart rate felt too high. She said the heat felt like pressure rather than temperature, like something sitting on top of her. Jabari was struggling too. He said the ascent was nothing like the descent and that he thought they needed a different plan. He knew about Phantom Ranch, a small lodge and ranger station at the canyon floor about a mile from where they were, and he suggested they head there, explain the situation to rangers, and arrange an alternative exit rather than trying to force the climb in the middle of the day.
And surprise, surprise, Brandon rejected the idea immediately.
He told them they had made it down without any real trouble, and that going up couldn't be that different. He said they were psyching themselves out. Jabari pushed back, said the climb genuinely felt harder, and Brandon's response, according to both Jabari and Lucy, was to call them wimps. He said something close to, "You guys quit way too easily." Lucy told him she was serious.
I think it's obvious she wasn't being dramatic. She was telling him what her body was actually doing, and Brandon dismissed her.
A group of nearby hikers overheard the exchange. One of them, an older man with a full backpacking setup and the kind of tan that comes from a lot of time outdoors, pulled Brandon aside and told him plainly that continuing alone during the hottest part of the day was dangerous, that the canyon claimed people every summer who thought the same thing he was thinking, and that there was no shame in using Phantom Ranch. Brandon thanked him and turned away. Jabari told Brandon one more time to stay with them and go to Phantom Ranch. Brandon told him he'd be at the rim hours before them, that they were making a bigger deal out of this than it was, and that he'd see them when they figured it out. Then he started climbing. The other hikers watched him go. Jabari and Lucy stood there for a moment and then turned back toward Phantom Ranch. That was the last time either of them saw Brandon conscious. Alone on the trail now, Brandon lost the only people who might have slowed him down. In the beginning, he probably felt something close to vindication. He was moving, he was ahead, and the story he would tell back at school was already writing itself in his head, the version where his friends underestimated themselves, and he proved the point by finishing alone. He passed other hikers heading upward. He was still moving at a pace that would have impressed most people on that trail.
But the heat was doing what it does. You have to understand that the South Kebab above the river is almost entirely exposed.
There are a few small overhangs and rock formations, but nothing that qualifies as shade for more than a few minutes. The trail surface absorbs heat and radiates it back upward. The air temperature in the direct sun is higher than the ambient temperature. Every step up is a step closer to the rim, but also a step further into accumulated heat stress that had been building since Brandon first stepped onto the trail 6 hours earlier. His water supply, which had already been insufficient for the conditions, started disappearing faster. When you are working hard in extreme heat, your body needs far more water than most people expect, not just to replace sweat, but to support the physiological processes that keep your core temperature from climbing into dangerous territory. Brandon was a large, muscular person. Large, muscular people require more water, not less. His body was working hard to cool itself, and it was running out of resources to do it with. His pace slowed, then slowed again. He started taking breaks that stretched longer than he probably intended, sitting on rocks in whatever patch of partial shadow he could find. The first physical symptoms of heat illness would have arrived somewhere in here, and this is consistent with what witnesses on the trail observed and later reported to investigators. A headache that doesn't respond to rest, a low, rolling nausea, dizziness that comes and goes, muscle cramps in the legs that make each step harder than it should be.
When other ascending hikers stopped to ask if he was okay, and mind you, several did, Brandon told them that he was fine.
Just tired, and that he's almost there. The trail to the rim was still several miles above him when he was saying this.
Needless to say, his pride had become its own trap.
Turning around, which was no longer a realistic option anyway, would have meant admitting that Jabari and Lucy had been right. That the ranger had been right. That the sign had been right. That everything he had spent the morning dismissing as noise meant for other people had actually been meant for him. His brain, trained by years of athletic culture to interpret stopping as weakness, wouldn't let him sit with that even as the organ doing the interpreting was beginning to cook inside his skull. Heat stroke doesn't begin the moment you collapse. It is a process. The core temperature rises, the body's cooling mechanisms begin failing. The brain, which is exquisitely sensitive to heat, starts malfunctioning in ways that are invisible from the inside, meaning the person experiencing it often cannot perceive that their thinking has become impaired. Judgment degrades before the person realizes their judgment is degrading. It is one of the most dangerous features of the condition. Brandon kept climbing. By mid-afternoon, Brandon was somewhere between Skeleton Point and the rim, several miles above the river and still several miles from safety. He had been on the trail for nearly 10 hours. The canyon was at its hottest. His body had been accumulating heat stress since before noon. Witnesses later told rangers they had noticed a tall young man moving erratically along the trail. His gait was unsteady. He was veering slightly on the switchbacks rather than tracking the center of the path. He sat down several times in places that offered no shade, which suggested he was stopping not by choice, but by necessity. One group of hikers described stopping to ask him if he needed help. He became irritated and told them he didn't. His words were slow in coming, and the sequence of them was slightly off, not obviously wrong, but enough that one member of the group said later it felt like talking to someone who had just been woken up. They kept watching him from a distance. A few minutes after they spoke to him, he came around a switchback and stumbled. He caught himself on the rock wall beside the trail. Then he stumbled again. The group moved back toward him. This time, his skin was visibly wrong, extremely hot to the touch, and dry rather than wet, which is a sign that the body's sweat response has begun to fail. That failure is one of the markers of full heat stroke rather than heat exhaustion. His responses to questions were confused and delayed. He didn't seem to know what time it was or how far he had come. One member of the group activated emergency services using a satellite communicator. However, Brandon did not sit down. He kept moving upward one slow step at a time for another short distance.
I guess it's safe to say that the same drive that had pushed him past every warning that morning had, in the end, been the mechanism of his destruction.
His confidence had kept him moving when his body was begging him to stop, and by the time his body won the argument, it was already losing the fight. Rangers were dispatched quickly after the emergency call came in, but the Grand Canyon does not cooperate with urgency. Helicopter evacuation from within the canyon in mid-afternoon in July is complicated by a combination of factors. The intense heat reduces air density, which affects lift capacity, the terrain is narrow and irregular, and wind conditions in the inner canyon can be unpredictable in ways that don't always show up on instruments at the rim. The options for a fast aerial extraction were limited. Ground personnel reached Brandon on the trail. When medical responders took his core temperature, it was critically elevated well into the range where organ damage becomes a near certainty without immediate aggressive intervention. They began cooling him on the trail using whatever resources they had: ice packs, wet cloth, shade from bodies and gear positioned to block the sun. Every minute of core temperature above a threshold damages tissue, including brain tissue. The body's systems, kidneys, liver, heart, brain, begin failing in sequence once heat stroke is established and the cooling response has broken down. He was unconscious by the time evacuation was completed. Rangers and medical personnel worked him the entire way out. His body was young and strong, and it fought the way a good engine will run on fumes longer than a weaker one. But the damage by that point was not something fitness could reverse. Brandon Kowalski died later that evening at a regional hospital. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as exertional heat stroke, with severe dehydration and multi-organ failure as contributing conditions.
Mind you, he was only 21 years old.
Jabari and Lucy had reached Phantom Ranch, received assistance from rangers, and hiked out the following morning via the Bright Angel Trail, the longer but more sheltered route to the rim, with water stations along the way. Lucy told investigators she had replayed the conversation at the trailhead 100 times in the days after, trying to find the sentence that would have changed it. Rangers gently told her there probably wasn't one, not because the situation was inevitable. It was because the specific combination of factors Brandon brought to that trail made him nearly impossible to reach by the time the warnings started.
The Rangers who worked the case noted something that has stayed with me.
They said Brandon was one of the most physically capable people they had ever seen on a heat fatality report. His resting health, his conditioning, his cardiovascular baseline, all of it was exceptional. The problem was never his body. The problem was that he had spent years building an identity around what his body could do, and that identity had no room in it for the idea that some forces simply do not care about your fitness level. The canyon is not impressed by your deadlift, it is not watching your film, It runs on temperature and elevation and physics, and it applies those things equally to everyone who walks into it.
The kicker, Brandon never got the chance to understand that. He died still believing that he was fine.